Campeão mundial do futebol brasileiro.
Kelly Clarkson. Tickle.
Precious.
Happy 2002!
The year is 2002. Eminem's got white kids LARPing as battle rappers, Anakin's got beef with the freaking sand, and we've got ourselves a brand new batch of animated films to review. I'm Josh, your resident nerd with microphone, and welcome to Keyframe, the series where we attempt to right the Academy's wrongs towards animation by covering all of the animated films in a given year, narrowing it down to a crop of 5 nominees and selecting a new, or not so new, winner of Best Animated Feature to top it all off. And after retrospectively awarding Spirited Away with the 2001 Oscar for Best Animated Feature in our last episode, the race for the 2002 award is suddenly a whole lot more interesting now that its original champion is out of contention. Like last year, the films were deemed eligible according to our 5 core criteria, which for the uninitiated were fully explained in our 2001 episode, so definitely give that a watch if you haven't already to learn more. Our crop for 2002 yielded a total of 16 films, same as last year, which we'll cover from worst to best before tackling the final 5 nominees in random order. So, without further ado, let's get started.
Adam. Go there. What's up, my brother? What's going on, man?
Adam Sandler seems like a cool guy. Sure, he's known the world over for lucrative broad comedies, stand-up shows full of musical bops, and the occasional knockout dramatic role, but he also plays pickup basketball in the reg, dresses for comfort over style, and has even gone on record that he often makes movies just so he can work and hang out with his loved ones. That's some real wholesome stuff worthy of commendation right there. But at the same time, I'd be lying if I thought many of those same films produced by Happy Madison Productions were any good. Little Nicky, Jack and Jill, Pixels, and my least favorite of the bunch, The Ridiculous Six, are all films that embody the worst aspects of your lowest of the lowbrow comedies. But luckily, animation has been mostly spared from this variant of film, and most of the animated features that Sandler's ended up starring in have actually turned out quite well. That is, except for one notable exception. The lone film to come out of Happy Madison's now defunct animation division, Meatball Productions, 8 Crazy Nights is the movie equivalent of taking a Magnum bar with its delicious chocolatey shell and replacing the ice cream inside with some 3 a.m. post-Taco Bell dukage, with the chocolate representing the film's art and animation, and the poo being, well, everything else. Meet Davey, an alcoholic asshole with a rap sheet who's once again gotten tangled up with the law. While in court, the judge is about to send Davey up the river for a whole decade before an albino smurf named Whitey offers to have Davey ref youth basketball games alongside him as community service. The judge agrees, but warns Davey that one more slip-up means his ass will officially become public property for the next decade in prison. Davey must now tag along with Whitey and finally get his act together, as the holiday season rolls in with stockings full of emotional baggage. Now on the surface, this seems like a solid by-the-numbers outline for your standard holiday film, what with our redemptive protagonist, kindly old man, and ticking clock narrative device courtesy of the court order. But the characterization and humor manage to let the film down at every given opportunity. Davey is, for lack of a better word, an insufferable dickhead. Crass, cruel, and grossly obnoxious all throughout the film, up until the final act where the movie tries to convince us that he's worth our sympathy. But the sad fact is that it just doesn't work, and it all has to do with Davey's motivation behind his antics, as well as who and what he decides to direct them towards. The movie initially tells us, in song mind you, that this is all due to a serious case of self-loathing, but really, Davey's just bottling up his emotions following a childhood tragedy, one in which his parents died in a car accident on the way to his youth basketball game during Hanukkah. And yeah, that'd make anyone want to hate Hanukkah, family, and anything else surrounding such a horrific event, but Davey's actions don't really reflect that perspective. Let's compare him to another holiday grouch, Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. Scrooge had his harsh actions centered around the Christmas season and his miserly relationship with money because his tragic past revolved around his love of wealth over his fellow man, with key moments throughout his life occurring at Christmas time. Whether he was tossing wreaths at carolers, sending two men attempting to collect money for the poor packing, or adamantly refusing his nephew's offer to join him and his wife for Christmas dinner, every mean-spirited action was centered around this conflict, providing a sense of cohesion to his character and making his eventual redemption all the sweeter. But that's not the case with Davy, who instead takes a broad shotgun approach with his malice. He dives in ditches at the Chinese restaurant, humiliates a kid for being fat in front of an entire audience until he runs off crying, donkey punches some random dudes on the street, and turns the only man in town who treats him well into a turdsicle. None of these actions are directly motivated by his past grievances, leaving us with nothing but cruel antics and eventual redemption that falls flat and utterly tasteless gags around every corner, most of which are centered around this guy. Meet Whitey, a diminutive old-timer who, along with his twin sister Eleanor, serve as the canvases for Adam Sandler to paint his disaster piece. Yeti tier ass hair, toilet seat cover necklaces, and the baffling decision to make the most recurring gag in the entire film be somebody having a freaking seizure, it's all just the absolute worst. And to top it all off, there are Sandler's voices for these characters, subjecting the audience to their own personal hell with Whitey's piercing whimpers,
It is Bavarian cream filled, hubba bubba,
and the grating nasality of Eleanor's ramblings.
It's a home invasion rivalry!
And just when you think it can't get any worse, they start singing!
They took my wig, I remember the look in their eyes.
But it's not just the vocal chops or lack thereof at times that makes the songs in this movie so bad, because the lyrics might just be even worse. Anytime these songs put together a decent melody or seem like they're communicating a genuine heartfelt sentiment, an unfunny punchline is right around the corner to undercut it all. Patch Song starts out as an alright track where Whitey outlines his dream of being recognized for his efforts as a referee, until we're suddenly hit with Miss Triple Tit and some dudes pissing themselves. Long Ago aims to outline Davy and his childhood sweetheart Jennifer's relationship, but is constantly interrupted by cringeworthy non-sequiturs from Whitey and other characters who have no business being in the song. An Intervention Song sees corporate logos and products lecturing Davy about addressing his pent-up negative emotion, until a GNC supplement bottle makes the odd horny comment about some sentient lingerie. Somehow, the oft-memed Technical Foul is one of the most cohesive songs in the whole movie alongside Bum Biddy, which has a decent groove, but it's wasted on a film like this. And that goes 100-fold for the lone bright spot of 8 Crazy Nights, the animation. Because whatever these guys got paid, it wasn't enough. Director Seth Kearsley worked as a storyboard and layout artist on great projects like The Max and The Simpsons, so it's not like he's some in-house scrub with no experience in animation whatsoever. The animation studios that were brought onto this film were no slouch either, having animated on The Prince of Egypt, The Iron Giant, and Titan AE among other high-profile projects. And man, does it ever show. The character designs are distinct, the acting on display is expressive and easily readable, and the characters' broader movements have the perfect amount of weight and timing to them to make the animation truly shine. It's all top-notch work, but one way or another, 8 Crazy Nights manages to drag any semblance of talent associated with it down to rock bottom by forcing these talented men and women to animate poo-licking reindeer, sweaty jockstrap ass cracks, Miss Triple Nip's breastfeeding, and one of the most obnoxious sequences ever put into an animated film with this collective laughing fit. It's a terrible film across the board, and it's a crying shame because there really was an opportunity to do something special here. I may not be Jewish, but I know how much my favorite Christmas movies and specials have had such a positive impact on my life after watching them countless times with my family. And it'd be cool to see something similar done on a large scale for Hanukkah. What's surprising to me is that Adam Sandler would be one of the first guys that I'd have in mind for this sort of project, considering how much his Hanukkah song from SNL seems to resonate with folks if the internet comments section is anything to go off. So for Sandler to miss the mark this badly with a film that takes its title from a lyric from that very song, it only amplifies what a disaster 8 Crazy Nights was then and continues to be now.
This is the happiest seizure of my life!
Bullshit. Bullshit. That I love. I absolutely love.
Everyone interacts with art on a regular basis whether we realize it or not. It might be through a song that you belt on your way home from work, a piece of commercial photography trying to sell you on a product, or a gripping story communicated through text or film transporting you to another world. These are the typical, oftentimes comforting art pieces that slot themselves into our daily lives. But then there's the other side of the coin. The side that's home to art that's a bit more challenging.
What on earth was that?
Whether it's the mind-melting world of the avant-garde casting stones at convention, or the at times painfully authentic efforts of outsider artists bearing their souls for the world to see, sometimes the works that are the most out there also end up being the most memorable. But that can be a double-edged sword. Sometimes it ends up being memorable because it expanded your horizons as to what's possible and challenged your assumptions of what you previously found enjoyable. Some of my favorite games, albums, comics, and films are all wonderful oddities that will stick with me forever. But other times, these efforts leave a noticeably worse impression on me, with the experimental approach and abstract ideas only muddying the intended message and harming the overall experience. For me, these are films like Conspirators of Pleasure, Escape from Tomorrow, and our next film, Tamala 2010, A Punk Cat in Space. Written and directed by Trees of Life, a music-centric art collective consisting of Kei and Kuno, Tamala 2010 is easily one of the strangest anime that I've ever seen. And I'm not talking about your typical top 10 weirdest anime moments WTF Japan material on YouTube, or when you'd watch Dragon Ball as a kid and the second your mom opens the door it goes from lighthearted martial arts escapades to Goku's hands-on approach to learning anatomy. No, Tamala 2010 is a notably different flavor of strange. Our story begins in Meguro City, a hyper-capitalist dystopia host to a giant autonomous Colonel Sanders with a hatchet in his head and an endless stream of advertising material courtesy of the monolithic Caddy & Co. conglomerate, which practically owns the entirety of Cat Earth. Here we find Tamala, a cutesy cat who rebels against her human gamer mother by flying off on a spaceship towards her birthplace, Orion. However, her ship is eventually shot down as she crashes onto Planet Q near the tumultuous Hate City and befriends a male cat named Michelangelo. Together they encounter a fetishistic sadist dog, a zombified time-traveling professor, and a conspiracy surrounding the influence of a secret death cult, with Tamala at the heart of it all. So yeah, it's an odd film to say the least, but it's far from one of those lol so random projects because it does have something to say in its portrayal of the titular feline. Tamala is meant to represent the typical corporate kawaii character, much in the vein of Sanrio's endless arsenal of cuddly mascots. Large sparkling eyes, infantile speech patterns, and a tendency to view any stranger as a friend signal to us that Tamala's on her way to being a first ballot cash cutie Hall of Famer. But then she starts chain smoking, swearing like a sailor, roundhousing randies on the street, and suggestively dancing for a chanting crowd. And it's clear that Tamala's existence serves a notably different purpose than Hello Kitty. It's revealed that Tamala is actually a reincarnation of Tatla, the goddess of the Minerva cult, who secretly spread their influence under the guise of Caddy & Co. Tamala is utilized in the company's advertising for any and all products before being sacrificed and reincarnated periodically as an eternally young symbol for the conglomerate in their pursuit of world domination. In other words, companies present visually appealing mascots to push product, manipulate the masses into mindless consumption, maintain the status and image of said mascot as the public eats up anything bearing its image like some sort of deity, thus allowing the company to grow indefinitely at the eventual expense of the populace. It's a solid enough thesis for what it is, but what hampers this film's message and really all of 2010 in general is the abysmal writing, editing, and overall filmmaking on display. Just like a package or letter in the mail, you could have the most incredible content inside rendered completely obsolete if it isn't properly packed, sealed, processed, shipped, and handled. Execution is key, and the execution on display in Tamala 2010 is very poor. Shots can linger for far too long, droning on aimlessly rather than cutting effectively to amplify the images on screen. There are multiple shots in this movie where we are fixed to a single visual for 30 seconds or longer. These two shots in particular last for nearly a full minute and nothing ever changes. And it's not like the sequencing of these scenes fares any better. Settings, characters, plot points, and seemingly random one-off events all just whoosh by without any fanfare. And look, I'd be more willing to buy all of this so long as we're treated to some sick visuals or the sort of gripping dialogue that has you hanging on to every word, but Tamala fails on both of these counts as well. While the visual style is certainly interesting in stills, it doesn't do itself any favors in motion. And though I do want to give props to the lone 2D animator on the project, Kentaro Nemoto, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out some of the unappealing uses of camera shake and CGI throughout the film. But by far, the dialogue has gotta be the single worst aspect of Tamala 2010 in my opinion. Lines in this film range from overly descriptive prose straight out of a high school journal, dry exchanges between Tamala and Michelangelo that failed to endear, and the type of slick, indirect, casual dialogue straight out of a Tarantino fanboy's first screenplay courtesy of these two red light felines all serve to make sure every word feels like an absolute chore to sit through. And it's a shame because when I first started coming up with the idea for this series and compiling lists of the films that would be included for each year, Tamala 2010 was actually one of the films that I was most excited to see. The poster was eye-catching, the descriptions were intriguing, and it was something that I had never seen or heard of before. But after having watched it twice for this review, I'd be more than happy if I never saw it again. Sure, it has something to say, but just because a film has a definitive message, that doesn't automatically make it good. My brother once had a classmate in his art classes that would just draw wieners and burn them with a lighter, and no amount of alleged meaning thrust upon it could change the fact that his art sucked, and the same applies here. At least the soundtrack is a decent listen. Maybe Trees of Life should have just stuck to making music. If you're an aspiring filmmaker looking to make an animated adaptation of Pinocchio, then get the hell in line because you are far from the first guy to have that idea. Pinocchio might just be the most adapted story in all of feature animation, and to make things even worse, it was pretty much perfected on the first attempt. So, what can you do to stand out? Later attempts at tackling this story would send our puppet protag into space, pit up against horrific magical entities, take a stab at different animation techniques, or dock him 100 IQ points for the hell of it. But regardless of the gimmick, it all circles back to the same classic tale, with perhaps the most out there variants coming in the form of 2002's A Tree of Palm. Directed by OG anime legend Takashi Nakamura, best known for his work as a key animator, animation director, and even director on projects like Yatterman, Nausicaa, Robot Carnival, and Akira, A Tree of Palm follows the titular Palm, an android crafted by Foe to care for his ailing wife Xion. Following her death, Palm shuts down for several years, only fully returning to consciousness after a mysterious woman resembling Xion asks him to deliver a special egg to a distant land. And so, the now reawakened Palm ventures off into the unknown egg in hand, as he encounters friend and foe alike on his quest. I'll cut right to the chase. This is a very frustrating film for me. All flash, no substance. Though the film is teeming with appealing character designs reminiscent of old school works like Cyborg 009, expressive character animation like Palm's half-conscious zombie-like lurches, and plays host to a world that feels truly alien due to its strange creatures and haunting Ons Martineau heavy score, it utterly fails in terms of character, particularly in the case of Palm. Simply put, Palm lacks personal agency. Everything he does is merely a reaction and completely tied to his memory of Shion. He only becomes conscious because he sees Karam and thinks that she's Shion. He only accepts Karam's egg quest because she looks like Shion. He's only intrigued by certain places because Shion hails from them. And of course, he only approaches Popo and decides to become human for her sake because she, say it with me now folks, looks like Shion. Now sure, I could see this one-track mind approach for Palm's character working if the film played its cards right, showing us Shion's deteriorating health, the scientists' resolve to create Palm as a servile solution, the budding connection between Palm and Shion, and Palm's loss of purpose following her passing, all in real time. But that's not what happens. All we get are some short flashbacks played out of order and the odd parallel comment coming from the scientist here and there. So any chance of the audience getting emotionally invested in these characters is immediately squandered. And perhaps what sucks the most about this approach to Palm's character is that the Pinocchio framework is built upon its character's agency. Disney's take on the character chases after his goal of being a real boy from start to finish, only ever deviating from that path due to his naivety, up until the moment that he matures and decides to take action on his own once Geppetto's life is endangered. Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio presents the audience with a thesis centered around control, as Pinocchio consistently and deliberately goes against the wishes of those who seek to make him both a literal and figurative puppet. Even the hilariously bad Pauly Shore version of the character had his wish for agency made loud and clear in the movie's trailers.
Father, when can I leave to be on my own? I've got the whole world to see.
It's this anemic take on Palm's character, the lack of any creator-creation dynamic between him and the scientist, an utterly forgettable supporting cast, and excruciating 2-hour runtime that have me checking out early every time I watch A Tree of Palm. So, in honor of that bloated runtime, let's say we check out early on this section of the video and move on to our next film. For the longest time as a kid, my brother and I grew up watching local TV channels, cycling through a midweek rotation of educational programming to pass the time. And though some of these titles stood out as some solid shows for what they were, it was all about the weekend cartoons. Suddenly, we'd be spoiled for choice with a slew of great shows to watch on Kids WB and the Fox Box, only for them to disappear once again as Monday rolled around. But that would all change whenever we'd go somewhere with cable installed. Suddenly, it didn't matter what day of the week it was. Every day was Saturday. And with it came a daily dose of Saturday morning quality cartoons courtesy of the Big Three. There was Disney Channel and its bevy of IP-based programming, the best of the bunch coming from reruns of late 80s and early 90s favorites. There was a new kid on the block, Cartoon Network, boasting the most daring and varied lineup of its kind. And lastly, there was my childhood favorite of the Big Three, Nickelodeon. If Disney Channel played host to the classics and Cartoon Network championed the cutting edge, then Nickelodeon was the home of the most iconic made-for-TV cartoon characters of the era. You had Doug, Ren and Stimpy, Rocco, the Angry Beavers, Tommy's Gang of Rugrats, SpongeBob, and many, many more. These cartoons consistently won me over with their wacky antics, but it was the most mellow show of the bunch that would stand as my childhood favorite. From the original run of claymation shorts, to the comic strip in Simpsons Illustrated, all the way onto the silver screen, Craig Bartlett's Hey Arnold was far from your typical 90s cartoon. In an era full of Looney Tunes revivalism, snarky anti-authoritarian protagonists, and various experiments in aesthetic, Hey Arnold instead pivoted in the other direction towards the measured slice-of-life musings of Charles Schulz's Peanuts comics. While it did have its fair share of kooky characters and funny moments, this was a show full of laid-back, jazzy vibes contrasted against the cynicism of big city life, as seen through the eyes of our precocious cast of kids. You've got the insecure meathead Harold, the shy pushover genius Phoebe, Eugene the walking jinx, Sid's paranoiac streak, the ultimate homie Gerald, American tsundere Helga, and many other great characters. But at the heart of it all was our soft-spoken protagonist Arnold, who embodied everything the show was about. He's endlessly curious, leading to scenarios where he'd investigate the city's countless urban legends or probe into the personal struggles of those around him. He's kind and selfless, offering respite from the often selfish and mean-spirited people of Hillwood. And more than anything, Arnold is an optimist, one whose positive perspective and decisive action clashes with the innate cynicism of the show's cast, inspiring them to do things they'd long thought were impossible. Whether he's helping Torvald pass his math test, guiding Pigeon Man and Stoop Kid out of their respective bubbles, engineering a Christmas reunion between Mr. Yun and his long-lost daughter, or rallying his friends to turn a vacant lot into their own personal baseball field, Arnold's mild-mannered humanism helped make the show an enduring classic. But while this sort of understated cartoon might work as a 22-minute show, that doesn't mean it'll hit quite the same as a feature film. But after the runaway success of not one but 2 Rugrats movies, Nickelodeon would be damned if they didn't at least give it a shot, resulting in the planned Season 5 mega finale Arnold Saves the Neighborhood to be shoved into theaters under the new title of Hey Arnold the Movie. Our story begins on a typical summer day in the city. Kids are outside playing baseball, eating ice cream, and getting drenched by the fire hydrants, until we suddenly cut to a demolition crew wrecking a nearby building. Turns out, a corporate mogul by the name of Sheck has bought up the neighborhood, with plans to bulldoze and develop it into a high-end mall. Distraught at the news, Arnold and the gang put on a community demonstration against Sheck's company, but to no avail. Now with the risk of losing their homes and culture, it's up to Arnold, Gerald, and a mysterious trenchcoat-wearing informant to find a way to stop Sheck and save the neighborhood. Now on the surface, it looks like we're running into the same old series to feature film issue of going big and going broke on the plot with these large-scale stakes. But that's not exactly true. Hey Arnold wasn't averse to having bigger conflicts in its episodes at times, with episodes like The Old Building, a story about the demolition of the long-standing Circle Theater being the closest we have to the plot of this film. However, the main difference is in which elements each story chooses to emphasize. The Old Building is primarily a personal story framed around a big event, with the central conflict coming not from the theater's impending destruction, but rather Arnold's relationships with Grandma Birdie and his friend Ernie. In the episode, Arnold gets caught between 2 promises, one that he first makes to Ernie saying he'll take part in his 500th career demolition, as the tradition is to have your son sit with you in the wrecking vehicle and Ernie never had a child, and another promise that he later makes to his grandmother to help her save the theater where she spent her youth. Later, we learn that Ernie's 500th demolition will be at the expense of the Circle Theater, forcing Arnold to navigate each side of this conundrum to find a way to do right by them both. It's a setup that plays to the strengths of Hey Arnold's character-centric bent, which is more than I can say for the movie. Here, the emphasis is not on the characters, but on the plot, much to the film's detriment as it only highlights how bland that plot is. This right here is your bog-standard evil businessman versus close-knit community story, hitting all, and I mean all, of the family film bullet points that you'd expect in the exact way that you'd expect. Press conference? Check. Sticking out and listening on the lackeys? Double check. Sneaking into the company's headquarters? Triple check. A hidden document foiling the villain's plans complete with the old cotton 4K reveal trope? Take a wild guess. The movie is just chock full of these sorts of cliches, which is an almost impossible hill to climb for most films not named How to Train Your Dragon, and here it's no exception. Now, to the movie's credit, it does try to mix some personal stakes into the fold for good measure. After the town starts to realize that Sheck's gonna wreck the neighborhood, people start reminiscing on old times and lament the loss of their homes. A perfectly solid setup for some pathos. But the way we transition into these moments feels so artificial, with Arnold just walking up to each of them one at a time, asking what's up, and having their memories dumped onto his doorstep like we're in freaking Shenmue.
Years ago, I was Chinese. Is that so?
It's a far cry from the more layered characterization Hey Arnold is known for, leading to the whole affair feeling like a dumbed-down bargain bin version of what we get in the show. From the almost non-existent spacing and rhythm and much of the dialogue, to characters like Super Spy Bridget being introduced into the story completely out of nowhere just because the plot demands it, to the unappealing cartoon movie shading that's been memed to hell and back on the internet, Hey Arnold the movie is another in a long line of disappointing series-to-film adaptation in the world of animation. So for anyone whose only exposure to Hey Arnold is through this film, or is just now hearing about this IP, trust me when I say that the show is miles ahead in quality, and totally worth your time. Watch the show, skip the movie. Looks like we're going to be saying that a lot in this series.
That's it, girls. No more Disney TV for a while.
It's sad to see how far Disney has fallen. The once proud empire known for continually pushing technical and artistic boundaries has been gradually reduced to a hollow shell of its former glory. The parks that once housed a bevy of groundbreaking and original attractions such as the Haunted Mansion or Pirates of the Caribbean have been tainted by an IP mandate-induced slew of uninspired re-themes and reimaginings. Their animated output has been slowly restricted to almost nothing but sequels as they continually pander to rabid Disney adults. But without a doubt, modern Disney's crown jewel of crap has got to be the wave of live-action and live-action remakes of their animated back catalog. For over 10 years now, these movies have taken multiple beloved classics and completely sucked all the color, charm, energy, and heart right on out of them, spitting in the face of the original films and the artists who made them a reality. But as bad as these remakes are, and trust me, they're bad, it's not the first time that Disney's been obsessed with cashing in on their past successes, as before this current era of live-action remakes, there was the age of direct-to-video sequels. Be they a recent runaway success or one of the Disney Vault's senior residents, all films were ripe for iteration by the now-defunct Disney Toon Studios. The studio would crank out several of these babies onto home video every year to varying degrees of success, but every so often, Disney Toon would get the chance to spread their wings on the big screen. They'd start with a couple of films based on TV shows, with DuckTales the movie in 1990 and a Goofy movie in 1995, as well as a new entry into the Christopher Robin cinematic universe with 2000's The Tigger movie, before deciding to take a stab at Peter Pan, one of the Silver Age classics with its aptly titled sequel, Return to Neverland. Our story takes place years after the original film. Wendy's all grown up and now raises two children of her own, her son Danny and our protagonist Jane, who after her father goes out to war, grows up far too soon. Though Wendy continues to pass on the Peter Pan stories to her kids and even uses them to try and lift everybody's spirits during these trying times, Jane openly derides the stories in front of her family, labeling it all as childish nonsense. But one night, before Jane and Danny can be evacuated to the countryside, Captain Hook and his crew mistake Jane for Wendy, kidnap her, and whisk her away to Neverland. Now Jane needs to find her way back home, but she may need a little help from those silly fairy stories to do so. Right off the bat, I really like how Jane's arc is essentially the opposite of Wendy's arc in the original film. Wendy was a girl who didn't want to grow up, threatened by the ticking clock of being moved out of the nursery and into her own room. Afterwards, she and her brothers voluntarily escaped to Neverland with Peter Pan to escape her oncoming transition into adulthood, hoping to prolong her childhood for as long as possible. While in Neverland, Wendy matures and sees there's more to life than endless play, while still holding on to the exuberance and wonder of childhood. Jane also finds herself in a situation where she's confronted with the prospect of growing up, but in contrast to her mother, the issue is not in her refusal to adopt more adult sensibilities, but in her overly rigid application of those traits. Jane conflates anything childlike as being childish, thus serving no purpose in a world filled with war, strife, and responsibility. She's taken to Neverland against her will in a sack, as opposed to Wendy's joyous flight, encapsulating Jane's view on childhood as a trap to be avoided rather than a freedom to be embraced. While in Neverland, she learns to loosen up, embrace the lighter side of life, and flies back home a more balanced and exuberant person. It's a damn near perfect setup for a Peter Pan sequel in theory, but the film lets itself down with middling execution. First off, Jane's portrayal in the beginning of the film might be a bit too adult. I can understand putting on a strong face during wartime, turning her nose up towards fairy tales, and even the idea of her giving Danny socks as a gift. But at the same time, we also see this girl out during a bomb raid and doing radio comms in the family's bomb shelter, which I don't know if that was actually a thing that British kids did during the war, but until proven otherwise, it still feels far-fetched to me. The big fight between Jane and Danny in the beginning feels incredibly forced and rushed, and the immediate transition into a non-diegetic song sequence with super on-the-nose lyrics doesn't help either. And maybe the last thing that I take the most umbrage with is how the film takes a hard turn towards making it an issue of faith. Jane says that she doesn't believe in fairies right to Tinkerbell's face, thus starting a ticking clock for Jane to catch the belief bug, or else Tink's light will go out forever. But to me, this feels like the wrong direction to take the story. I mean, Jane's already seen the effects of Tink's fairy dust after Peter Pan took her on a flight back to his hideout, and we already know from the opening act that Jane is a very much seeing is believing type of person, so the faith angle seems contrived to me. But that's not the only aspect of the film that falls short. As though this may be a theatrical film and the voice acting is solid across the board, I can't help but notice things that make Return to Neverland feel like yet another direct-to-video sequel in the Disney canon. Everything here is far brighter and more saturated than the 1953 original's hazy, dreamlike veneer, and it's probably because this movie is a lot more cartoonish in tone. While the first film was no stranger to physical comedy and exaggerative expressions, Hook and his crew were still shown as legitimate threats and given a certain degree of dignity to complement their menace. Well, except for Smee, of course, but that's as intended. However, here everyone from Smee to the crewmates to Hook himself are all borderline Looney Tunes made to be the butt of the joke in almost every scene that they're in. The action scenes don't feel like swashbuckling sword fights a la Errol Flynn. They feel like comedic set pieces for slapstick comedy, and that cartoonish bent continues to ring true in other scenes like the giant octopus's off-model tasting of Hook, Tinkerbell ricocheting around from the force of Jane's sneeze, and everything with the Lost Boys from their gross-out handshakes to moments of tune logic while they're searching for Jane. It ends up making everything feel serially unserious, which only harms the film's attempts at having genuinely emotional beats as we're struck with this tonal whiplash. Add on top of this a slew of member-berry moments like the greatest hit-styled opening to the force-fed flight through Neverland's most famous locales, and you've got yourself a majorly conflicted sequel that can't seem to escape its predecessor's shadow. Maybe if the film balanced the more colorful and bombastic aspects with subtler, more atmospheric ones, and had a more airtight approach to developing Jane's character, then I could have found myself really engaging with it. But for now, it'll just have to settle for being one of the lesser evils from Disney's direct-to-video era. When it comes to consuming and enjoying art, there seems to be a strange paradox at play. Obviously, in most cases, the better the movie is, the more you're likely to enjoy it. And yet, at the same time, it can be such a blast to watch some absolutely awful films, especially with friends. Looking at these two conflicting phenomena, it becomes incredibly clear that sometimes it's better to be memorable than good. Which is why I think the most painful films to watch are often the ones that can be summed up with a single expression of indifference. Meh. The story, meh. The characters, meh. Reflection, conclusion, meh, meh. It might be the single worst reaction that a piece of art can elicit, one that requires an almost Herculean effort to overcome. And every so often, we get a performance that does just that. These are the performances so over the top, so gloriously cranked up to infinity that watching them becomes a spectator sport in and of itself, single-handedly carrying the movie's viewing experience. Nick Cage in Vampire's Kiss, Willem Dafoe in The Boondock Saints, even Christopher Walken in The Country Bears, all of these performances managed to outlive their respective films and have gone on to entertain countless people even without the aid of context. And though it's exceptionally rare, you'll also see the same thing happen in the world of animation from time to time. Some of my favorite examples are Patrick Warburton in The Bee Movie, Alan Rickman in Help I'm a Fish, and our subject for this section of the video, Ronan Vibert as Laird in 2002's The Princess and the Pea. I'm gonna keep it quick. The Princess and the Pea as an overall film is textbook mid. The songs are pleasant enough in the moment, but I'll be damned if I ever recall a melody or lyric. The animation is solid enough with its heavy use of rotoscoping, but it's nothing exceptional, and there are some expressions and movements that don't feel quite right. And many of our core characters are wonderbread levels of bland, with the exception of two: Hildegard, the spoiled royal, and the crown jewel of the film, her father, Prince Laird. This character is simply a joy to watch. He looks like if Captain Hook and Tullio from the Road to El Dorado fused, has the sniveling, whiny disposition of Prince John from Disney's Robin Hood, and above all is deliciously and flamboyantly evil. And he loves it.
I'm evil and I love it.
He plots, he schemes, he holds victims ransom, has a ready-made escape tunnel overflowing with swinging death traps, and although his plan to switch his baby with the king's to steal the throne years later was solid enough to work as is, he just had to insist that that very child be molded into a spoiled headcase like himself.
Elsa, she's wonderful.
And that clip brings us to his strongest aspect, his voice, courtesy of character actor Ronan Vibert. Vibert provides Laird with a voice that's somewhere between the high-class slithery affectation of Jonathan Freeman's Jafar,
Hello, wife.
and the singularly hammy qualities of a peak Tim Curry role.
My reign was short but glorious.
Some of these line reads are just hilarious, either because of some odd rhythms and timings,
No! You ruined my track. You pig!
or because of how explosively exaggerated Vibert's vocals can be.
When I'm crowned, I'll have you hung, drawn, and quartered, and I will squash your measly kingdom like a bug.
And going back to the Prince John comparisons, I love how most of these reads have a droning whine to kick them off, almost like he can barely contain himself before speaking.
I want the kingdom!
It's such a fun performance from Vibert, one that's well worth watching even if the rest of the movie is nothing to write home about, which is the highest compliment that I can pay him. Rest in peace, good sir.
Get ready to say uncle. Jackie Chan Adventures is next. Then prepare for battle with Pokemon Johto League champions, followed by Yu-Gi-Oh! Here on Kids WB.
I can vividly remember watching cartoons growing up with my little brother. There'd be the old gold on their daily reruns, the current hotness getting all the promo for their newest episodes, and every so often, you'd even get a full-on movie to watch for the day too. But suddenly, one day we both had a realization. People made these cartoons. These weren't just dreams channeled into a little box for our viewing entertainment, but ideas that were conjured up and fine-tuned over time. We suddenly became obsessed with any and all behind-the-scenes materials we could find, oftentimes playing the special features discs of our DVDs more than the actual movies and shows themselves. And honestly, that still holds true for me now. And one of the things that I'm often most interested to learn is what some of the earliest versions of these cartoons were like. Sometimes the pipeline from inspiration to completion can be relatively smooth, but in other cases, you're left baffled by what preceded the final product. Benson and Mordecai from Regular Show began life as the drug hallucinations of convenience store clerks. An early cut of Finding Nemo left Marlin's backstory unknown until near the end of the film, causing test audiences to hate him for most of the movie as a result. And Stitch was originally portrayed as an undercover mobster in an early version of Lilo and Stitch, a far cry from the erratic and sympathetic fluffball we ended up getting. But one of my favorite examples has to be with Craig McCracken's Whoop-Ass Stew, a tongue-in-cheek short film starring 3 superpowered little girls. Girls who'd eventually make their way to Cartoon Network, trade in their can of Whoop-Ass for some Chemical X, and take over the airwaves under the new name of
the Powerpuff Girls!
This was and still is a special show. sporting a unique visual blend of UPA's sleek geometry, 60s anime cuteness, Hanna-Barbera-esque narration and dialogue spacing, the thick outlines of its Cartoon Network contemporaries, and perhaps most famously, dynamic action sequences punctuated by rapid-fire cuts, punchy sound effects, and some honest-to-God, actually violent fight choreography, all helping the show stand as a favorite for both boys and girls alike. It's like if a kid who grew up watching reruns of Underdog ended up becoming a huge Dragon Ball Z fan and made a kick-ass cartoon. And I love it. Not gonna lie, rewatching the first 4 seasons of the show for this review was an absolute blast. I was laughing my ass off at the wild antics of the mayor, whose oblivious nature is amplified tenfold by Tom Kenny's amazing performance. I was digging the group dynamic between our 3 heroines, who each get their own episodes in the spotlight. The show's rogues gallery is incredibly versatile, running the gambit from joke villains to evil counterparts, hammy scene stealers, and him. The intro is fire, there are plenty of pop culture references and adult jokes for older viewers, and I am consistently enthralled by the show's quick cuts and static camera. All in all, it's no surprise that the show was so popular, and given that its heyday was during the era of cartoons hitting the big screen, it was only a matter of time before Blossom, Bubbles, and Buttercup would do the same, culminating in the 2002 release of the Powerpuff Girls movie. In the city of Townsville, crime runs rampant, with anywhere from the bank to the grocery store serving as a potential stage for villainy. Here we meet Professor Utonium, a good-natured scientist who concocts a recipe for the perfect little girls: sugar, spice, and everything nice. However, after a wild fit from his lab monkey, the professor accidentally adds some chemical X into the mix, resulting in a massive explosion and the creation of the supercharged Powerpuff Girls. He races the girls as his own, but finds challenges in dealing with their superpowers, culminating in a game of tag gone horribly wrong that leaves the city in tatters and the girls ostracized by society. Now the girls have to repair their reputation with the populace to prove that they're not just another menace on the loose, unless a shadowy entity is able to convince them otherwise. So yeah, the film decides to run with an origin story plot, which for the life of me I do not understand the need for. I get the concerns about new audience members lacking familiarity with the show and not knowing who's who, but then again, this is one of the rare times that repurposing the show's iconic intro, an intro that includes their origin story by the way, would have been the preferable move, as it would have gotten the introductions out of the way and allowed for more creative freedom. But if you are going to do an origin story, then at least use it as an opportunity to flesh out your characters. We never get any insight on why the professor decided to make the girls in the first place. Was he lonely? Did he have a wife that died and they couldn't bear a child together? Give us something! And Mojo Jojo's the same way. We're introduced to him while he's mid-freakout and cut to him later as someone who suddenly hates the Powerpuff Girls and humanity at large. But we never get to see him start harboring these feelings towards either party over time, which makes his villainous turn later in the movie feel random for anyone not familiar with the show. Now, I know that this backstory is accurate to the Season 1 episode Mr. Mojo Rising, but that worked for the show because Mojo's erratic behavior and instantaneously evil turn was a contrasting punchline to Mojo's proposed sob story, whereas the movie plays everything straight and falls flat because of it. And the girls themselves aren't even exempt from being shortchanged either, as they're treated more like a unit than individual characters here, which robs us of any dynamic interactions between the 3 of them throughout the picture. And I think this piss-poor characterization can be partly attributed to 2 key issues with the film. The first is its pacing, which is way too slow. A ton of these scenes go by at a snail's pace, with very little actually happening. Dialogue scenes are spaced out far too long. We linger on dead air for far too long. Jokes that people can see coming from miles away drag on, once again, for far too long. And when it isn't the smaller scenes that are overstaying their welcome, the pacing manages to kill the more bombastic sequences too. Case in point, the nearly 8-minute long game of tag between the girls, which could have been cool in theory, but is held back by the constant stop-start rhythm of the scene's major beats and incredibly underwhelming music straight out of a licensed racing game underneath. And it's rather telling that the longest action scene in the movie isn't a fight scene, Because the second key issue I see is that there seems to be a deliberate kid-friendly bent in the movie's tone as compared to the show. The show's tongue-in-cheek retro sensibilities seem to have been completely ironed out in favor of vapid schmaltz between the professor and the girls. The color palette is noticeably brighter to the point of being sterile, not to mention the lack of old-school abstraction in the backgrounds and crowds. And the violence has been toned way down, both in its frequency and its intensity. It all just ends up feeling like a watered-down version of the show, but that's not without a few little nuggets of quality squeezing their way through the cracks. For as comparatively bright the color palette can be in certain shots, in others it is really appealing, particularly in those opening nighttime stills and during the final battle. The art style translates very well to the big screen, with characters like the Gangrene Gang and Mojo looking better than ever. There are some notable uses of a 3D camera here too, which for a show that was so committed to having action occur during rapid static shots, feels like a neat cinematic flourish indicative of the big screen upgrade. And as someone who is endlessly fascinated by animals, seeing all of the different super apes at the end of the film using tactics befitting of their various breeds was a nice little treat. My favorite's gotta be this Japanese macaque just chilling in the water as he floods the city. So yes, there are certainly aspects of the Powerpuff Girls movie that I enjoy, but in the end, it's just okay. And though you can certainly do worse than okay, it's still a far cry from being great. And a great show like the Powerpuff Girls deserved a better movie than this. When talking about Asian animation, the discussion tends to be centered almost exclusively around Japan and China, which given their contributions to the medium's past and present, makes complete sense. But one other Asian nation that deserves some shine is South Korea. As though it may not sport the same level of history and prestige as Japan or China, it still has a story that is well worth telling, particularly in the world of television animation. Though the country has produced its fair share of popular domestic cartoons, and Japan seems keen on making their fair share of manhwa adaptations these days, Korea has most famously been pivotal in the American TV animation pipeline due to the prevalence of outsourced animation. For the uninitiated, most American cartoons are animated in studios outside of the US to keep costs as low as possible, with many of these studios being based in South Korea. Whether it's a broad comedy like The Simpsons or a stylish action series like Samurai Jack, many of our favorite cartoons were made possible by the talented men and women that make up South Korea's animation industry, and at times they've even managed to improve the final product. One famous example is with Avatar: The Last Airbender, where JM Animation tweaked the show's original character designs to be more animator friendly, resulting in the S-tier television animation that the show would become famous for. But as for the country's feature animation landscape, things are a bit different. Though they've been producing domestic animated features since 1967 Hong Kil-dong, and have even produced outsourced animation on American feature films like the Powerpuff Girls movie, it hasn't been until the dawn of the 21st century that we've started seeing South Korean animated features produced more regularly. You've got international collaborations like Achi and Shipak, domestic gems like Leafy: A Hen into the Wild, the distinctive grit of Yang Sang-ho's films, and one of the earliest films in this new wave of Korean animated features, 2002's My Beautiful Girl Mari. The directorial debut of Sung Gang Lee, My Beautiful Girl Mari follows Namwoo, a typical company man who reunites with his childhood friend Junho, a student who will soon be leaving for 3 years to continue his studies. During their conversation, Namwoo begins to reminisce on a time in his childhood when, much like the present, it seemed as if everyone in his life was leaving him behind. Junho was set to move away to Seoul. His widowed mother was spending more and more time with her new boyfriend, and his grandmother's health was rapidly deteriorating, all of which would lead Namwoo into isolation. But one day, he finds himself transported into a magical world where he meets a mysterious girl named Mari, who in turn provides him with a welcomed escape, if only for a few minutes at a time. Now Namwoo finds himself alternating between his disappointing reality and the intrigue of the magical realm, as the end of summer break gradually draws near. Mari is one of those films that I like to describe as visual background music. Pleasant, calming, and effective at setting a nice mood, but not very substantive beyond the surface, as it doesn't lend itself well to intensive viewing. Let's start with what it does well. The visuals are incredibly pleasing on the eyes, with soft outlines, little to no shading on our characters, and a subdued color palette that perfectly conveys the simultaneous beauty and mundanity of Namu's sleepy seaside town. It's a visual style that sort of reminds me of Waking Life or The Flowers of Evil, except substitute the ominous tone and rotoscoping for traditional animation and nostalgia. Mari's magical world is also really appealing, with twisting flora, airborne particulates, and a hazy fog that remind me of the spirit world from Avatar and Korra, and these rotund flying animals in particular give me huge Senkoro vibes. The music further enhances the aesthetic, with tons of reverb, hard panning, and wistful melodies in the distance that add an almost romantic tinge to Namu's retrospection. It all makes for a light and comfy watch, but I still find myself wishing for something to add to the weight of the proceedings. Take the film's opening shot for example, a beautiful sequence set to gorgeous vocals and string arrangements that flies us in and around the city. It effectively establishes a certain atmosphere for the film, but over the course of its 4 minutes, nothing of significance ends up being communicated to the viewer. We don't see any key landmarks nor the daily routines of any significant characters in our story, just a series of nice images set to pleasing music with little in the way of substance. This same sentiment applies to how Mari's magical world is utilized throughout the film. The movie portrays this world in the vein of a magical realist narrative, where we're not quite sure if anything we see during these scenes is real, or if it's just an abstraction of Namu's thoughts and feelings. And let me be clear, when this approach is done properly, I am a huge fan of it. Movies like Pan's Labyrinth, Where the Wild Things Are, Birdman, or Millennium Actress just wouldn't be the same if they told their stories in a more straightforward manner. But one key difference between the fantastical elements in these films as opposed to those found in My Beautiful Girl Mari is that not only are these elements interesting on their own, but they have a clear and dynamic relationship to the events in our protagonist's life and their interpretation of said events. The toad in Pan's Labyrinth acts as a stand-in for how Ophelia views her unborn brother, as the toad feeds off the roots of a tree at the tree's expense, much like how her mother's difficult pregnancy has taken a toll on her health. The monsters in Where the Wild Things Are all share traits of people in Max's life, be it his mom, his sister, his father, or even Max himself, as they unknowingly recreate his emotional and relational conflicts and allow him to process them accordingly before returning home. The titular Birdman, as well as Riggan's superpowers, allow us to visually dissect Riggan's ego, the different masks that he wears in his professional and personal lives, and the difficulties that he faces in both worlds. And Millennium Actress uses its mishmash of autobiographical memory and Chiyoko's various roles as an actress to illustrate how the venerated performer views her life and career in retrospect, as her final curtain call draws near. More on this in my 2001 video, by the way, click on the link in the description to find out. However, My Beautiful Girl Mari doesn't quite follow suit in this regard. The instances where the movie decides to have Namu end up in Mari's realm oftentimes don't coincide with any significant emotional, character, or story beats. Our first trip to this world takes place after Namu finds his favorite stray cat in the lighthouse. Another takes place after Junho gets his heart broken, but he wouldn't find himself in Mari's world until much later in the film. Over and over, the timing of these sequences are poorly related to the highs and lows of the narrative, which, given the lack of any symbolic representation that you could attach to Mari herself, leaves the magical realist elements feeling like just another series of pleasant but paper-thin visuals. I'd still recommend anyone who finds themselves intrigued by the visuals to give the film a chance, as they may be far more forgiving to it purely for its tranquil vibes, but I can't help but be left wanting so much more from it. Similar to a movie like Waking Life, there's an alt-universe version of this movie that I could easily find myself falling head over heels for. But given its surface-level approach to characterization and thematic coherence, I'm afraid that's an impossibility for me in this universe.
There's gotta be something interesting to watch on here. Okay, critically acclaimed by our in-house critics. Nice.
In this age of hyper-specialized entertainment, you're never spoiled for choice. If you want to watch a horror movie at home unedited and uncensored, you can. If you want to watch a holiday special out of season, go ahead and tell the calendar to kick rocks. And if you're a kid looking to make every day a day for Saturday morning cartoons, the power is in your hands. But just a few decades ago, that couldn't be further from the truth. Slasher movie villains were forced to pull their punches in made-for-TV edits. Holiday programming was gridlocked to their respective seasons. And not only were Saturday morning cartoons limited to, well, Saturdays, but there wasn't even a dedicated channel catered specifically to kids. Or at least there wasn't until the introduction of a revolutionary new television network.
Nickelodeon!
Launching on April Fool's Day 1979 as the first ever children's network, Nickelodeon would go on to carve out an empire by entertaining kids all across America. But, as they often say, Rome wasn't built in a day, and the same was true for the old Nick. The earliest programs broadcasted on the network range from edutainment series aimed at young preschoolers, like the Sesame Street-esque Pinwheel, to short-lived variety shows aimed at teens such as America Goes Bananas. But as time went on, Nickelodeon would slowly start to shape its own identity. Canadian sketch comedy series You Can't Do That on Television would introduce the infamous green slime, which would eventually become a network staple and appear on other shows like Double Dare, the first in a long line of original game shows on the network, rocketing Nickelodeon to the top of cable programming. But the empire of Slime's crown jewel would come in the form of its vaunted Nicktoons, original made-for-TV cartoons that established themselves as classics for an entire generation of kids. And no studio played a bigger role in Nickelodeon's first wave of animated success than Klasky Csupo. Formed by the then married couple of Arlene Klasky and Gabor Csupo in 1982, Klasky Csupo would get their start by animating logos and title sequences for projects like Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, and the original 21 Jump Street. Eventually, they'd move on to doing the titles for The Tracy Ullman Show, giving them the chance to work on a series of short, animated bumpers with a young cartoonist by the name of Matt Groening. Those bumpers were The Simpsons. Klasky Csupo would end up animating every single Simpsons bumper on The Tracy Ullman Show, along with the first 3 seasons of The Simpsons proper, before absolutely carrying Nickelodeon's pre-SpongeBob lineup with a slew of solid cartoons, including Rugrats, the network's first mega hit. The series would become so popular that it would spawn not 1, but 2 theatrical films, each grossing over $100 million. Nickelodeon was eating it up, and given how successful the 2 Rugrats movies were, the network naturally turned its theatrical ambitions towards Klasky Csupo's second most popular Nicktoon. Hot on the heels of Hey Arnold's trip to theaters, the Wild Thornberrys movie takes the jungle-trekking, savannah-surveying wildlife adventures of the hit show and gives it a premium big-screen upgrade. Our story follows Eliza, a girl blessed with the ability to speak to animals by the wise shaman Niambo, as she travels with her family of wildlife documentarians across the African continent. One day, a mother cheetah leaves Eliza to watch her cubs, but after they all wander too far from home, poachers snatch up one of the cheetah cubs in their helicopter and try to make their escape. After Eliza's attempt to rescue the cub falls short and ends with her narrowly escaping a horrific injury, her parents and grandparents decide to send her off to a boarding school in London to keep her safe. Shortly after arriving at the school, Eliza begins having dreams of Shaman Niambo telling her that the cheetah cub is still alive and that it's up to her to save it. Now Eliza must make her way back to Africa to save the kidnapped cheetah cub and stop the poachers before the next step of their nefarious plan rolls into action. The Wild Thornberrys was an animal-centric show that came out at the perfect time, 2 years after the premiere of The Crocodile Hunter and just 5 months after Animal Kingdom opened its gates. And this focus on wildlife lends itself perfectly to a theatrical glow-up. Unlike Hey Arnold the movie, which was haphazardly moved into theaters, the Wild Thornberrys movie was always intended to be a theatrical production, and nothing communicates this better than the film's visuals. This is easily some of, if not the best usage of quote-unquote cartoon movie shading that I've ever seen, as it not only has a setting in the African wildlands and jungles that provides a good rationale for all of these shadows, but balances things out with some great color choices. This is where I think Klasky Csupo evolved the most since the first Rugrats movie. That movie was very dim, even in environments where more light and color would make sense. But here, The colors are so much more vibrant and well measured regardless of what time of day it is, where our characters are located, or even if they're fully conscious, cause that art style switch up during Eliza's dream is freaking sick. Speaking of that dream, it also highlights the rock solid animation on display, particularly in the facial expressions and physical acting on the characters, which given how stylized these designs are, it's something to be commended. Speaking of the characters, I think the best thing that the Wild Thornberrys movie does to avoid falling into your usual TV to theatrical film adaptation trappings is by framing the story primarily around a character-centric conflict. Unlike Hey Arnold the movie or even a similar project like Recess School's Out that focused on large-scale macro-level stakes at the expense of their characters, this movie here presents Eliza with personal stakes tidily interwoven into a broader conflict involving poachers. The first problem presented to Eliza is her exile to boarding school, which not only sees her thrust into a smaller, hyper-structured environment as opposed to the wide open spaces she'd grown accustomed to, but she's also barred from socializing with the wild animals, whose company she prefers over humans. She manages to grow a bit by being forced to interact with other girls her age, and even makes a few friends along the way, much to her surprise. But later on in the film, we get our second and largest personal conflict for Eliza, one in which, spoilers for the uninitiated, go to this timestamp to skip, she willingly sacrifices her ability to speak with animals in order to save her sister Debbie from the poachers. This is huge for multiple reasons, as this not only results in Eliza breaking her promise to Shaman Nyambo and severing her connection to the animal kingdom, but it also allows her and Debbie to be on the same page for the very first time. Eliza and Debbie have always been polar opposites. Eliza's having the time of her life exploring the wilderness, while Debbie wishes she was quite literally anywhere else. Eliza sees boarding school as a cruel punishment, while Debbie would trade places with her in a heartbeat. But in this instance, now that Debbie knows why Eliza has always spent so much time with the animals, the two end up closer than they ever were before. Plus, Debbie actually gets some shine here too, as she goes further out of her way than ever before to save Eliza despite her apprehension towards nature. If there are any downsides here in terms of character, it'd be that Nigel and Marianne end up getting lost in the shuffle, which is a shame because I always liked the dynamic that they had not only with each other, but with the rest of the family unit too. But don't get me wrong, I think they made the right decision in the long run. Plus, if the movie stayed with the family more often, then we might have been forced to sit through more unfunny scenes with Donnie, who is way more annoying here than he ever was in the show as far as I recall. Actually, the humor across the board is a lot weaker by comparison too, coming off as a lot more juvenile aside from a few clever visual gags like this one with Darwin at the airport. The original show was never the most laugh-out-loud funny cartoon, and most of the humor was hard carried by Nigel in my opinion, so it makes sense that similar issues would rear their heads here. The music is also a mixed bag, ranging from warm background tracks with an African tinge to obnoxious bursts of random drum and bass and bouncy pop inserts. But overall, the Wild Thornberrys movie is a solid first attempt at bringing the show to the big screen. I wouldn't say it's Nickelodeon's best series to film adaptation, that title easily goes to the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, nor would I call it the network's best effort at that point in time considering that Rugrats in Paris came out 2 years prior. Regardless, it's still a fun film that's worth a watch if it piques your interest, hence why it sits at the number 8 spot on this list. After 3 years and 3 feature films struggling to find an identity, DreamWorks finally found their pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. $484.9 million worth of gold to be exact. Shrek was the eureka moment Jeffrey Katzenberg had been dreaming of for his nascent animation studio, and he didn't hesitate to capitalize on it, immediately putting a sequel into the works and deciding that the future of DreamWorks animation would be exclusively found in the third dimension. However, before this hard pivot towards only making computer animated features could fully take shape, they would still have to finish their 2 remaining 2D animated projects, the first of which being 2002's Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron. Every horse girl's favorite animated film, our story follows the titular Spirit, a wild Mustang who goes from young foal to a stallion, baby, and becomes his herd's leader. One night he decides to investigate a local campsite and ends up getting wrangled by American cavalrymen, who bring him across the frontier and into their fort. There, the soldiers try to break Spirit's resolve and have him submit to their will like the cavalry's other horses. Now Spirit must overcome subjugation at the hands of these militants and find his way back to his herd, but not before possibly finding a new herd in the process. Now, Spirit for me has always been one of those movies where my opinions end up caught between two extremes. On the one hand, this is a movie with some mind-meltingly good 2D animation, especially given the subject matter. For as many true-to-life animal-centric animated films that had come out over the medium's history, none of them dared to tackle the daunting task of realistically rendering horses due to innate challenges in capturing their anatomy and physicality. So needless to say, animating on this film must have been a colossal hill to climb. But through the help of actual experts in horse studies and live horses that serve as reference material, they were not only able to nail down the design and draftsmanship of these fine creatures, but also inject them with a wealth of kineticism and personality. There's never a moment where you're unsure of what these horses are thinking and feeling. A change in posture here, some little flourishes in movement there, and the simplistic yet brilliant addition of thick, expressive eyebrows would have did wonders for you, Lion King 2019. All ensure that we fully empathize with and understand Spirit throughout the picture even without the aid of dialogue. Which, side note, makes the moments of Matt Damon narrating Spirit's inner monologue feel incredibly redundant, but at least the movie keeps them to a bare minimum. The animators absolutely cooked in how they animated the horses, but there's one more aspect of this film's animation that I find absolutely stunning, and much of it can be traced back to a very special artist. Meet the man, the myth, the legend, James Baxter.
James Baxter!
Senior supervising animator on Spirit, and someone uniquely positioned to work on this project. See, Baxter is an animator who's revered in the industry for his uncanny mastery of perspective, able to expertly adjust the form and flow of his drawings in sequence even when the camera's constantly moving around the characters. He got a crash course in these skills working under another master of perspective, Richard Williams, while animating on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, before moving on to Disney and becoming the go-to animator for sweeping shots of 2D characters compositive over CG backgrounds like the ballroom sequence in Beauty and the Beast or the sanctuary scene in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This skill would prove crucial for Baxter and every other animator working on Spirit, as this movie would push 3D camera work and quote-unquote tradigital animation compositing to its zenith for the time. All throughout the film there are these grand sprawling shots. The unbroken 2.5-minute opening shot sees us flying through canyons, over waterfalls, and across fields at the level of a bald eagle. Spirit's attempted escape from the Wranglers has the camera trailing him from below. And the many glory shots of Spirit up on these hills as the camera does a full 360-degree sweep around him all require that same deft hand across perspectives demonstrated in Baxter's prior work, and it's clear from the footage that he and his team knocked these scenes out of the park. Now sure, not every visual element in the film is perfect. There are some CGI characters in the background that stick out like a sore thumb, but overall, it is an astounding feat of animation. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, there's the film's use of music. Now right off the bat, I want to clarify that my issues with Spirit's music are not due to Hans Zimmer's score. Zimmer does a serviceable job here across the board, save for the comedic music played over Spirit's shearing scene. Rather, my ire is squarely aimed at Bryan Adams' grating vocal tracks. Unlike in Toy Story or Tarzan, where the song sequences serve to cram a lot of visual storytelling into a stylish montage with music that fit the film's aesthetic, Spirit does the exact opposite. Aside from the first musical sequence, every song here only serves to make the storytelling more inefficient by stretching out a single event that could either be told without music or in a far quicker manner. The sequences of Spirit being dragged to the fore and bucking aggressively like a rodeo horse come to mind, with the songs taking power away from the images on screen and leading to a slew of gratuitous cuts in the process. The lyrics in these songs are also way too on the nose, constantly describing things that are already on screen in obnoxious soft rock and then contemporary radio rock stylings. And speaking of which, this musical style clashes hard with the visual aesthetic of the film. What do any of these sounds have to do with the late 1800s American West? At least in Tarzan, they had some instruments like marimbas, layered vocals, and other musical flourishes that added some jungle-adjacent flavor and kept things cohesive. But Spirit's array of Bryan Adams sung tracks feel so out of place by comparison and take me right out of the movie as a result. It just reads to me as a film that's unsure of itself and chasing easy trends rather than going all in on what would work artistically, much like how they couldn't fully commit to having a mute main character. In a way, it's similar to how I felt about Atlantis with its conflicting highs and lows, but ultimately, I think Spirit comes out a bit stronger in the end by comparison. Hence why it claims the number 7 spot on this year's list.
K-Tel Records presents the most inspirational Christian rock band in the world, Faith Plus One, featuring the very best in good, wholesome Christian music.
I grew up in a strict Christian household, which meant that my brother and I were somewhat limited in the media that we could interact with. Sure, our parents were only looking out for us and even got it right on many occasions, but there were still instances where their lack of media literacy would start to surface. And because of this cautious approach to media, our parents would often default to the safest possible outlet to ease their decision-making process: Christian children's entertainment. Here you'd find movies, TV shows, and home video releases that all varied widely in terms of quality, ranging from old school classics still in circulation, sanded down animated retellings of biblical stories, all the way down to some embarrassingly bad work that could draw the ire of anybody in attendance. And look, I don't say all this to disparage Christianity or all Christian media as a monolith, as I still keep the faith today and understand why media like this exists. But I'ma keep it real with you guys. Most of my thoughts align almost one-to-one with a certain Hank Hill quote from King of the Hill.
Can't you see you're not making Christianity better, you're just making rock and roll worse?
But there was one piece of Christian media that was an exception. One that anybody, be they Christian or not, could get something out of. And that series was VeggieTales. Created by longtime friends Phil Vischer and Mike Naraki, VeggieTales was the little engine that could for big idea productions. The studio would get their start doing graphics for commercials until one day they got the itch to make a series that taught kids biblical values in a way that was fun and engaging. Vischer had the idea of animating sentient food, aiming to avoid any potential problems that features such as limbs, hair, or cloth could pose given the limitation of 3D animation software at the time, thus leaving the characters' eyes, mouths, and postures to convey emotions. The idea initially began with a set of animated candy bars in the spotlight, but much like how Lillian Disney convinced Walt to name his cartoon mouse Mickey instead of Mortimer, Phil Vischer's wife Lisa opposed this idea by suggesting that candy bars could have a negative influence on kids. Phil agreed and racked his brain to think of an alternative before one day sketching out a cucumber and settling on vegetables as his muse. Vischer would go on to produce a short 17-second animation test titled Mr. Cuke's Screen Test in January of 1991, starring a certain buck-toothed cucumber, and suddenly the VeggieTales train was picking up speed, but not without some much-needed help. Vischer and Naraki would cast their friends and family alongside themselves to voice the characters, recruit their church's musical director Kurt Heinecke to produce the series' tunes, and they'd even receive some generous donations, one of which from an anonymous source who claimed that God had moved him to do so, all leading to the release of their first episode in December of 1993. While it may not seem like much today given how far technology has progressed, VeggieTales was actually a huge step forward for computer animation, releasing about a year before CG TV shows like Reboot first aired, and nearly 2 whole years before Toy Story would make its way into theaters. It'd go on to become the biggest direct-to-video series ever at the time, spawning merch, a stage show, a 2D animated spin-off series, and its very own theatrical feature in the form of 2002's Jonah, a VeggieTales movie. Out in the middle of nowhere, Bob and Dad Asparagus are driving the kids to see Twippo, a popular musician, live in concert. During the drive, conflicts emerge, as Laura begins taunting Junior with her backstage pass and Dad Asparagus keeps incidentally hitting Bob with his guitar as he and the children sing together. This chaos leads to Laura's ticket flying out the window and the van blowing a couple tires as it crashes short of a mysterious restaurant. A restaurant in which they'd meet the pirates who don't do anything. The pirates overhear Junior ridiculing Laura's sadness over losing her ticket, saying that she got what she deserved, as well as Bob's harsh remarks towards Dad Asparagus, whom he blames for the crash. So, the three stationary swashbucklers decide to teach them about compassion and mercy through the story of Jonah. Jonah is an Israelite prophet who preaches God's messages. But one day after God instructs him to preach about repentance in Nineveh, a city filled with corrupt, amoral fish slappers, Jonah decides otherwise and books the first trip to the opposite side of the world. He boards the pirates who don't do anything ship and encounters a small caterpillar named Halil before a fearsome thunderstorm breaks out. The crew suspects that God is angry with someone on board, and after Jonah confesses his disobedience, he's cast overboard and swallowed by a giant whale. Now Jonah must decide in his darkest hour to either change course and follow God's command with a more compassionate heart, or suffer due to his callousness inside the belly of a whale. So yeah, just like in the show, Jonah employs a structure that begins with a small-scale moral problem in the daily lives of our characters, segues into a related story with the occasional switch up here and there, before returning to our characters having learned their lesson and applying it to their problem. But while the show would naturally have the luxury of employing far shorter introductions and inserting one of the series' famous silly song segments, things become a little trickier in a feature format. The somewhat choppy opening act makes this clear, taking nearly 12 minutes for the Jonah movie to get to, well, Jonah, primarily filling the time with drawn-out gags and an admittedly catchy campfire-style tune. But once the Jonah portion of the movie does get going, it's much smoother sailing, and the franchise's greatest strengths get to shine on the big screen. First and foremost is the series' delightfully silly brand of humor, which ranges from Monty Python-esque absurdism, insertion of modern sensibilities into a bygone era, and the occasional subtle joke for the parents watching. One of my favorites being this little moment where Jonah announces that he has a message from the Lord, and the townspeople gasp in horror, which if you've read the Old Testament is a very understandable reaction all things considered. I will admit that the humor does fare better in the show where they can quickly go from one segment or scenario to another at a rapid pace, but this light and silly tone does more than just provide some simple gags and jokes. It also colors the way the franchise goes about adapting biblical stories. Though stories from the Bible can certainly be used to teach children age-appropriate moral lessons, it is far from G-rated if you catch my drift. But VeggieTales has always done a good job of making humorous adjustments to these stories while keeping the core intact, such as when they turned a story of adulterous lust and murder surrounding David and Bathsheba into the story of a king's wish to possess a peasant kid's rubber ducky for his extensive collection. Jonah continues this trend. The purported wickedness of the Ninevites is reduced to being rude people who slap anyone in their vicinity with a fish. Jonah is ousted as the source of the thunderstorm after losing a game of Go Fish, and the Ninevites only listen to Jonah's message because they worship fish and discover that he had survived being eaten by a whale. These are all choices that help make the story more palatable and enjoyable for kids without sacrificing the ability to entertain their parents too. And even though characters like Halil can fall into the typical trappings of an annoying gag character, it's still solid writing across the board capable of having elements like the Mr. Twisties bit actually pay off in the end. But undoubtedly, the star of the show for VeggieTales has always been its array of goofy, varied, and insanely catchy musical numbers. Whether it's the grand theatrics of Good Morning George as the camera soars through Nezer's chocolate factory, Larry having an existential crisis via operetta in the Hairbrush song, or the melodramatic love story between a gourd and his cheeseburger, musical director Kurt Heinecke consistently delivered bangers all throughout the series, and Jonah is no exception. Message from the Lord takes us into the ins and outs of Jonah's job as a prophet. Second Chances communicates the film's thesis in the form of a roaring gospel number. And even though there are no silly songs with Larry's segments, the movie still manages to cram in a few silly little ditties for good measure. Pair all of this with some solid animation, including maybe the most impressive body of water in any computer animated film ever at the time, and you've got yourself a fun film that does its series justice. And so with that, we've rounded out our runners-up for 2002. From here on out, we'll be looking at our top 5 nominees for this year's Best Animated Feature Oscar in random order before revealing our winner at the end. So without further ado, let's get started with our first nominee. Development hell. A horrible limbo where productions go to rot, unsure if they'll become fully completed projects or fade away in time as vaporware. It's a cruel fate that's befallen tons of creative endeavors, be they games, albums, or films among others. And given the grueling production cycle of your average animated feature, there have been plenty of examples from throughout the medium's history. The Thief and the Cobbler was in production for about 30 years before director Richard Williams was sacked, and the film was released in such a mangled state that fans have spent another 30 years restoring it to its intended glory. Phil Tippett abandoned work on Mad God for 20 years, believing stop motion would be replaced with CGI, before eventually finishing it through the aid of volunteers and Kickstarter donations 30 years after its inception. And Yuri Norstein has infamously been working on The Overcoat since before the fall of the Soviet Union, with seemingly no end in sight 45 years later. But while these films had hellish productions due to technical challenges, a lack of funding, or their director's ambitions flying way too close to the sun, there's one film that kept having its wings clipped before it could even take flight. Though it may have had an official 4.5-year production cycle before hitting theaters in November of 2002, Treasure Planet's actual big screen journey began in the mid-80s with these guys. Meet Ron Clements and John Musker, legendary Disney directors behind modern Disney classics such as The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Moana, and many more. However, from as early on as 1985, before either of them had even directed a feature film, there was one story that they wanted to tell more than any other: Treasure Island in space. It was the duo's longtime dream project, but every single time that they brought it up to the bigwigs at Disney, their pitch would be swatted away like a fly. 1985, Disney CEO Michael Eisner turns it down due to a similar Star Trek movie at Paramount that never ends up getting made. 1989, they give another shot after successfully co-directing The Little Mermaid, only for Eisner to tell him piss off and go make Aladdin instead. 1992, Aladdin rakes in an unholy amount of money, and the boys once again pitch Treasure Planet in space, this time to studio chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg. But Katzenberg is so obsessed with his plan to win Best Picture and thoroughly convinced that Pocahontas will be the film to do it, that he casts their pitch aside without a second thought. 1995, Clements and Musker decide to vent their frustrations to chairman of Walt Disney Feature Animation, Roy E. Disney, who sympathizes with them and convinces Eisner to strike a deal. If Clements and Musker completed their work on Hercules, then they'd have the green light to make their dream project a reality. They quickly agreed, finished co-directing Hercules together, and after nearly 20 years of trying, Treasure Island in Space would finally hit theaters in 2002 under its final title of Treasure Planet. Sometime in the distant future, Jim Hawkins thirsts for adventure, but between helping his mom barely keep the Benbow Inn above water, flunking out of school, and his multiple run-ins with the law threatening to land him in juvie, it seems as though he's marching towards a dead-end future. However, everything changes after a dying space pirate named Billy Bones crash lands outside the inn, warns Jim of an approaching band of pirates led by a cyborg, and leaves him with his most prized possession, a mysterious golden sphere. The pirates ransack the inn in search of the orb, and Jim escapes with his mom thanks to the help of their good friend Dr. Doppler, who shelters them in his home. Back at Doppler's house, Jim fiddles around with the sphere and manages to activate it, revealing it to be a holographic map leading to Treasure Planet, the mythical location of Captain Flint's trove. Now Jim, Doppler, and Captain Amelia must set sail towards Treasure Planet and claim their prize. That is, of course, unless a certain cybernetic crewmate has anything to say about it. At the time, Treasure Planet's main claim to fame was for being the most expensive 2D animated film ever at a whopping $140 million budget and failing to break even at the box office. But in recent years, despite the lack of sequels or Disney Parks attractions, it seems as though it's really grown on people, with many even considering it one of the studio's most underrated films. And honestly, I also fall into this camp, as Treasure Planet has only gotten better for me with each repeated viewing. First and foremost, let's get the obvious out of the way. This movie looks incredible. Obviously, when trying to adapt an idea like Treasure Island in space into a fully realized project, it's going to entail the incorporation of both the swashbuckling excursions of mid-18th century pirates and the blank canvas of a sci-fi future. Which ultimately raises the question, how much should you lean into each aesthetic? Lean too much to the pirate side of things and the space aspects will start to feel like a gimmick. Lean too much towards the sci-fi elements and you may end up losing the spirit of the original story. It's a tough call to make, but the team managed to crack the formula in the end with what they referred to as the 70-30 law. 70% traditional pirate material inspired by the Brandywine School of Illustration, and 30% sci-fi inventions like robots, spaceships, and aliens. And the result is something truly unique. The look of Treasure Planet feels like an author from the mid to late 1700s wrote a novel about what the future would be like, reinterpreting contemporary aspects of culture, technology, and infrastructure through a sci-fi tinted lens. Characters still wear colonial-era coats, hats, and dresses. All manners of spacecraft from Captain Amelia's galleon to the cop's dinky little hovercrafts have sails attached to them. Cannons, swords, flintlock pistols, and muskets are the weapons of choice. Textured windows and lockets now tout holographic projection, and Doppler's even got himself a horse-drawn carriage, only with a giant bipedal slug in place of the horse. All these elements synergize beautifully with the amber glow of the film's lighting and color palette to evoke a world that's simultaneously suspended in time and light years beyond our reach. But that's mostly what encompasses the 70 in the 70-30 law, as the remaining 30% in that equation helps sprinkle just the right amount of space oddities into the mix. In terms of environments, a spaceport was inevitable, but the artificial moon of Crescentia pushes the concept to the max and allows the film to flex its muscles as we sweep through its scaffolded streets. The titular Treasure Planet is another sick locale, equal parts Laputa-esque floating machine and flora-infested planetoid, complete with a score doing its best Dagobah impression. And just like with Star Wars, Treasure Planet boasts a cast of bizarre extraterrestrials to keep things truly alien. You've got rockmen like Mr. Arrow, amorphous shape-shifting blobs like Morph, mutant livestock straight from Tatooine, and above all else, a whole swath of animalistic hybrid characters. Some of them are quite straightforward. Captain Amelia is clearly a Sphinx cat with her prominent brow and ears, Billy Bones is a particularly sharp-edged variant of a tortoise, and Doppler's mutt mug wouldn't look too out of place in Goofy's universe. Whereas others push things just a bit further into the realm of obscurity, like this disembodied head dude whose starfish-inspired tendrils double as dreadlocks, the bloodthirsty Scroop's menacing scorpion spider crab body plan, or the almost grizzly bear-like protruding lips, fat neck, and wide nostrils of the movie's big bad, John Silver, who's made to be an even greater outlier by his cybernetic limbs thanks to some truly cutting-edge animation. For years, Disney had utilized computer animation to enhance their films with uniformly rendered pots, gears, cars, and environments, drawing a clear line in the sand between the two mediums' form and function. But as time passed and technology improved, fully CG characters would start to make their way into the studio's films, and even carry entire productions on their backs as evidenced by 2000's Dinosaur. However, Treasure Planet aimed to bridge the gap between the two mediums by seamlessly incorporating CG components alongside the rest of Silver's 2D body, a quantum leap into the future that would find its testing grounds in the past. The team would develop this new technique by repurposing animation of Captain Hook, figuring that if they could convincingly roboticize a character as expressively animated as him, then it would no doubt translate into Silver's acting as well. And the results speak for themselves. The blending on Silver's arm is fantastic, expertly colored and shaded, animated with just the right balance of fluidity and the occasional robotic jitteriness to sell the machinery at work, and approached with a Swiss Army knife style of functionality to inject some dynamism, character, and mystery to keep the audience entertained. I do think that the illusion can suffer at times during snappy movements, as the arm falls behind the rest of Silver's body and seems to disjoint from his shoulder line here and there, but given how much of a novelty this was at the time, it really holds up well. Plus, as a bonus, we even get treated to an entirely CG character in Ben, who really benefits from being entirely animated using one style of animation, as his sporadic bursts of movement and cartoonish embellishments on his mouth shapes and head size read way better than similarly quick movements by Silver. All these visual details in design, technique, and movement hold up extremely well and continue to dazzle over 20 years later, but they only work as well as they do because they're in service of character. The straightforward hero designs make them subconsciously easier for the audience to align with than the more obtuse designs of the villains. Ben's abrupt movements and wiry frame help hammer home his role as the long-marooned sailor who's lost his mind, although I could do with Martin Short reining it in a bit at times. Amelia and Doppler being modeled after cats and dogs respectively gives a logical base for their personalities to clash early on in the film, and makes their gradual transformation into a tender odd couple even more satisfying. Morph's lack of a defined shape not only feeds into his adorably entertaining brand of mimicry, but also underscores the fact that he doesn't hold any definite allegiance within the film's conflict. And in the case of Jim's Han Solo-esque getup and Silver's cybernetic replacements, they serve to isolate the two of them within their environments, en route to a budding connection. For Jim, Silver ends up becoming a surrogate father figure, as unlike his dad who'd looked past him when he returned home and ultimately walked out on the family, Silver actually sees Jim. Initially, Silver just intends to inundate Jim with menial labor to keep him out of his way as he readies his crew for their eventual mutiny. But over time, they start to connect man to man and he takes him under his wing, teaching him vital skills, lending an earnest ear, and offering words of genuine support that cut right to Jim's core as the two grow closer and Silver's internal conflict intensifies. On the one hand is his original dream of securing Captain Flint's treasure by any means necessary, even if it means violence, theft, and betrayal. But on the other hand, this dream would mean throwing away his newfound relationship with Jim, someone whose dedication and lofty ambitions moved him enough to teach him how to cook, tie boating knots, and sail through the stars like a proud father showing his son the ropes. Eventually, after Silver's plan begins to take shape, Jim is also faced with a choice. Does he stick it out with the father figure he never had against his own moral judgment, becoming exactly the nobody that the robotic officers predicted he would? Or does he take matters into his own hands and change his life's trajectory by abandoning easy wealth by doing what's right? And this is what makes their dynamic so great. Every time that the two of them collide throughout the rest of the film, they're each forced into this binary choice, one that sees them hesitate, momentarily reconnect, and play each other for a fool all the way up to the film's uplifting finale. It's quality writing like this paired with the film's ambitious animation that makes me sad that the film was such a financial disappointment, as it would have been neat to see how Disney further developed these animated advancements, and Silver is unquestionably the best redemptive antagonist in their animated canon. But between the gradual merging of 2D and 3D sensibilities in films like the Peanuts movies, Spider-Verse, and Klaus, the last of which was directed by Doppler's supervising animator Sergio Pablos, by the way, as well as the collective reevaluation of the film's quality in recent years, I think it's safe to say that time has ultimately done Treasure Planet justice. I mentioned earlier that my brother and I not only watched a ton of animated films growing up, but also became obsessed with how they were made too. Whether it was the development stage filled with concept art and story meetings, or snippets of rough and final animation during production, we combed through hours of behind the scenes footage to get a sense of how it's done. Naturally, we wanted to see this sort of thing in person at a real life animation studio, one that was close by so we could aspire to work there one day. But there was a problem. We lived here, and nearly all major animation studios were over here. Not exactly next door. It seemed like a pipe dream after that realization, but life ended up having a surprise in store for us, as we'd end up getting to see a top-end studio in action after all, in the most unlikely of locations. Disney World. Yeah, really. Beginning in 1989 with the grand opening of Disney's MGM Studios, the park once played host to the magic of Disney animation. A walkthrough attraction centered around the ins and outs of making an animated project at the old House of Mouse. It had many of the offerings that you'd expect from this sort of venue. A couple of infographics and edutainment videos here, some drawing classes with live instructors there, but the main highlight, and the part that stuck with me the most as a kid, was that you could get a glimpse of an actual animation studio at work, namely Walt Disney Feature Animation Florida. Originally a satellite for the main studio in Burbank, the Florida team would gradually go from assisting with Disney's Renaissance-era films to helming projects of their own. They'd kick things off with a trio of Roger Rabbit shorts before getting their shot at an in-house feature with 1998's Mulan, and absolutely knocking it out of the park. Naturally, they'd get the go-ahead for a follow-up, but not without some conditions. You see, then Disney CEO Michael Eisner had taken note of how the studio's last few animated films had performed and noticed a trend. After financially peaking with The Lion King in 1994 and continuing to rake in the dough at a ludicrous rate with Pocahontas the year after, budgets continued to rise in light of increasingly ambitious productions, while box office returns had begun to stagnate, especially in the new century. Because of this, Eisner wanted to emulate the success of 1941's Dumbo, a lighter, cheaper film made in an age of uber ambition that succeeded by running counter to the studio's prevailing trends. It was the misfit of Disney's golden age, and given the studio's tumultuous start to the new century, there was perhaps no better time to unleash a new misfit into their canon.
Oh, Bobby. Oh, Bobby.
You get your own movie.
It's honestly crazy how big Lilo & Stitch has become over the years. Multiple direct-to-video sequels, cartoon series made in the US, Japan, and China, an underrated GBA game, a low-key influential theme park attraction, a high-key trash theme park attraction too, tons of merch, tons of cameos, all on the way to making it one of the more fondly remembered Disney films of its era, and Stitch arguably their most popular character since Donald Duck. And the craziest thing for me, as someone who vividly remembers watching the film as a kid, is that he's still popular. I work with kids for a living, and I'll have a ton of them tell me how much they love Stitch Angel in the movie on a regular basis. And though unfortunately they're usually referring to the live-action remake whenever they say they watched the Stitch movie, no matter how buns the remake may be, it can't take anything away from the original. Out in the farthest reaches of space, the United Galactic Federation charges Dr. Jumba Chukiba of illegal genetic experimentation, the results of which being his latest and most heinous creation, Experiment 626, a hyper-intelligent, indestructible abomination whose sole drive is to destroy. The Council imprisons Jumba and shackles 626 in a high-security transport ship, as the venerated Captain Gantu escorts him into permanent exile. That is until 626 makes his escape, snatches up one of the nearby cruisers, and makes a beeline out of the Federation's reach by kicking it into hyperdrive. In his haste, he crash lands onto Earth and touches down on the Hawaiian island of Kauai, where he's promptly run over by a couple cargo trucks and placed unconscious into a local animal shelter. Elsewhere on the island, we meet Lilo, an idiosyncratic girl who lives with her older sister and caretaker Nani after losing both of their parents to a recent car accident, a tragic event that's had some serious knock-on effects for the two sisters. Lilo's offbeat tendencies cause adults to give her befuddled looks and end up isolating herself from the local girls, leading to her violently lashing out at them whenever they ridicule her. Nani finds herself overwhelmed with caring for Lilo, due not only to the newfound pressure to provide as the de facto head of their family and having to deal with Lilo's challenging behaviors, but also because she has social worker Cobra Bubbles breathing down her neck, questioning her caretaking skills and giving her 3 days to improve their situation before he puts Lilo into foster care. One night, Nani overhears Lilo wishing for a friend and decides to take her to the local animal shelter to adopt a dog. The very same animal shelter that now houses an unconscious 626. Upon waking up, 626 tries to escape, but finds himself cornered by laser fire from Jumba, who aims to capture his creation in exchange for his freedom. So, 626 proceeds to disguise himself as a dog and offers himself as a pet to Lilo for cover, who gladly takes him home and names him Stitch. Now these two misfits will have to learn to deal with each other's rough edges, en route to learning the true meaning of Ohana. Lilo and Stitch is one of those films that, in theory, really shouldn't work. Not because it's one of those bonkers high-concept ideas that feels impossible to execute, but rather because it's got a seriously tough balancing act on its hands. On one hand, the movie is a raucous cartoon full of sci-fi shenanigans, something that is immediately apparent during the opening sequence. This introductory stretch feels like a loving parody of sci-fi films, complete with over-the-top line reads, emotional outbursts, dry one-liners, bombastic sound effects, a militant score, and perfectly paced action set pieces full of escalating stakes until it all quiets down once Stitch gets away. No joke, this might be the most kinetic and well-paced action sequence the studio has ever rendered into animation. Everything from the meticulous buildup of Stitch's imprisonment and his deciphering of the DNA-locked turret's mechanics, to this great shot of Stitch blocking the laser fire with the rubble, to him cutting the power and snatching the police cruiser, to his reckless gremlin-like manner of piloting the ship, just oozes chaotic energy in the best way possible. Brief side note, but when they first started advertising the construction of Stitch's Great Escape at Magic Kingdom, my brother and I were certain that it would be a ride based on this particular sequence. We'd brainstorm our own queue, ride system, and layout to the point to where I even had vivid dreams about it that I can still recall to this day. And when the attraction finally opened and we learned firsthand that it was just a dismal reskin of Alien Encounter, it was probably one of the biggest letdowns of our nerdy little childhoods at that point. But there were plenty more where that came from, I can tell you that. But anyways, side tangent over, and we've got even more wacky sci-fi goodness to unpack, specifically with the visuals. Whereas Treasure Planet favored animalistic hybrid aliens, Lilo and Stitch opts instead for anthropomorphized alien animals that borrow traits from various species with the odd robot and goopy thing thrown in for good measure. We've got big old Captain Gantu and his whale shark hybrid head and colossal elephant feet, a hammerhead shark officer, the raptor-like soldiers, the adorable crewmates modeled after armadillos, axolotls, tigers, and more. Jumba kind of feels like an elephant seal got busy with some sort of beetle or just a large insect in general. And of course, Stitch himself is like if you took the body of a koala, the face of a bat, the rugged walk of a bulldog, the spines and danger of a lionfish, and blended them all together with the best and worst aspects of Gremlins' Mogwai for good measure. Maybe that's why Stitch and water don't mix, actually. And in another 80s adjacent nod, the initial dynamic between Stitch and Lilo feels like a great subversion of the classic kid meets alien trope that was found all throughout that decade, especially that of E.T. Stitch doesn't stick it out with Lilo out of a quickly established friendship or to cooperatively complete a sort of rescue mission, but rather because he needs a human shield to keep from being captured by Jumba. He takes Lilo on a whimsical bike ride a la E.T. and Elliot, but he's on a stolen big wheel and all just a front for Stitch to look for an escape off the island, only for him to freak out when he realizes it's surrounded by water. And whereas E.T. provided healing and made the lives of those around him better, Stitch destroys everything that he touches and makes Lilo and Nani's predicament even worse. It's just a bunch of well-crafted sci-fi splendor, and though it could have easily devolved into a bunch of hollow noise, this movie bridges the gap between its alien antics and human drama in some neat ways. One is through its setting in Kauai, an island paradise filled with natural beauty and quiet small-town life, as opposed to the grandeur of the Galactic Federation's assembly spaces and futurist technologies. Adding to this is the film's use of watercolor-painted backgrounds, which only serves to enhance this contrast via soft textures and naturalistic hues. And then there's co-writer and co-director Chris Sanders' unique art style, which imbues both the human and alien characters with similarly singular features. Sanders' characters have a really unique look and feel to them, drawn thick and weighted to the ground at the bottom, whilst gradually becoming thinner towards the top, with tons of round and fleshy contours all throughout the rest of the figure. You can see this in the tree trunk limbs of Gantu, Jumba, and Nani, Pleakley's Q-tip blob of a head, or the various folds of fat around characters' necks, arms, and backs. And then when it comes to their facial designs and expressions, things hard pivot away from realistic form and towards pure appeal, with widely spaced angular eyes, short foreheads, and cartoonishly large mouth shapes reminiscent of newspaper comic greats like Charles Schulz's Peanuts or Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes that open and close in an almost Muppet-like manner with their flat jaws. In another film, designs like these would stand out as odd or alien, but Lilo and Stitch manages to use them as a great equalizer between both the alien and human characters, which, considering the arcs of its two protagonists and seemingly opposing themes of alienation and family, is absolutely essential. The film presents us with three mirror-image relationships involving a disruptive child and an imperfect parent. First, there's Stitch and Jumba. Jumba chose to create Stitch, imbuing him with the express purpose of causing as much destruction as possible. And seeing as he was the lone authoritative hand behind Stitch's form and function, Jumba can only view him through the lens of his original intentions. He thinks he knows everything about Stitch, what he thinks, how he'll react in a given situation, and his ultimate potential to the point to where he's confident that he can track Stitch down and take him back into custody. But over time, as Stitch is stripped of his original purpose on the peaceful island and begins to reconstruct himself in new, surprising ways, Jumba is forced to contend with the possibility that Stitch's actions aren't wholly bound to his base programming, and eventually makes a change himself by joining Lilo and Stitch's makeshift family. Nani, by contrast, had the role of caretaker thrust upon her under tragic circumstances, and is understandably struggling with her newfound responsibilities. She's simultaneously trying to hold a job and provide as the makeshift matriarch of the family, raise Lilo, and keep tabs on a possible relationship with David, all while the threat of bubbles separating her from Lilo looms over her like a vulture. It's a difficult situation to say the least, one that she's had to sacrifice her peace, time, and even a potential pro surfing career if the trophies in her room are any indication, to get by as best as she can. But unlike Jumba, who thought he always knew what was best for Stitch and essentially went about solving his issues alone, Nani readily admits that she doesn't always know best and is open to help from other sources like David. David's a real one, a genuinely good dude who shows kindness to Nani and Lilo by cheering them up with an impromptu surfing session and connecting Nani with a job opening at their lowest point, all without expecting anything in return. And thank God someone's willing to help Nani out with all of this, because successfully raising a girl like Lilo is no easy task. Lilo is without a doubt in my mind one of the greatest portrayals of a kid in all of film, which as someone who works with kids for a living is something that I really appreciate. She's cute without being a one-note doll written to gawk at every inane thing around her. Rather, her most precious moments come from instances of raw, unfiltered emotions, actions, and perceptions, all of which contrast greatly with the growing pains of her juvenile behaviors. She'll sporadically jump from impassioned explanations over weather-controlling fish to beating the crap out of the girl who called her crazy for it, only to then immediately offer an olive branch of friendship by showing the girls her homemade doll Scrump, before being promptly rejected, slamming Scrump on the ground in frustration, and running back to it for an apology hug. Similar scenes take place at home, too. After the dance class incident, Lilo proceeds to lock Nani out of the house by nailing the door shut so she can mope out to some records, resorts to running away and slobbering on Nani's arm to evade consequences, and throws a crazy realistic tantrum once she is caught, only to tearfully reconcile once things settle down. Plus, she's also an incredibly precocious and creative kid too, showing a keen awareness of how people perceive herself and others, creating custom dolls out of fabrics and forks, and even going so far as to create custom narratives for things in her life, like how she rationalizes Scrump's giant head by pretending that bugs laid eggs in her ears. And this all feels so real because while Lilo can be naughty, caring, smart, or quirky, all of it is presented in an incredibly well-measured way that avoids overly cartoonish trappings and is backed by one of the best voice acting performances ever by a kid, courtesy of Daveigh Chase. But through it all, no matter how hard things got, Nani never gave up on Lilo and labeled her a lost cause. Something which Lilo must have taken note of given how she'd approach her own parental dynamic with Stitch. Lilo assumes a role somewhere between that of Jumba and Nani's, one in which she chooses to take care of Stitch much like Jumba chose to create him, but she also takes on the characteristics of her sister by seeing the good within Stitch and not giving up on him. Of course, being a kid, Lilo goes about things in her own unique way by assessing Stitch's badness levels, having him create something rather than destroy things, almost like a sort of art therapy, and emphasizing the importance of following in the king's footsteps. Honestly, she seems to come from the Lucy Van Pelt school of kid psychology now that I think about it. And ultimately, through all of this effort, Lilo does everything in her power to try and corral Stitch in the hopes of not only gaining the friend that she had wished for, but also bringing a fellow orphan into her family. I could honestly go on forever about the specifics of Lilo's unique blueprint for making Stitch a model citizen, some of the great character animation during both loud and quiet moments. I mean, seriously, there are some beautifully heavy lines in this movie for a family film. Or the fantastic use of original songs like Hawaiian Roller Coaster Ride and Hemele no Lilo alongside classic Elvis tracks. But if I did, then this video would probably be like 3.5 hours long and I gotta keep things moving here. But hey man, the fact that I can't shut up about the film is just an indication of how damn good that it is. Hence why it's our second nominee on this year's list.
With this device, you can instantly try out different ideas. It'll be used in television programs and adverts where the artist wants three-dimensional, solid-looking images. To date, the only alternative to making a model has been film animation.
Technology.
As someone born right before Toy Story's release and personally experienced its widespread ripple effect, 3D animation has always stood out to me because of the way your average person reacts to it. Unlike with 2D or stop motion where people might focus on the art style, color palette, or just dismiss it entirely as kiddie fodder, when it came to 3D animation, most people's attention was specifically directed towards its graphical fidelity. Comments like the water looked so real, the fur looked so real, and so on would be the prevailing takeaway whenever one of the major studios would release a new movie, highlighting that as much as 3D animated films are creative endeavors, more than any other form of animation, they are also technological endeavors. And perhaps no animation studio's history embodies this more than that of Blue Sky. The core of Blue Sky got their start at Mathematical Applications Group Incorporated, or MAGI for short, a computer technologies company whose original purpose in the mid-60s was to assist the government in measuring nuclear radiation through an early version of ray tracing. They eventually figured out that this ray tracing technique could be used to create CGI, leading to the creation of Synthovision in 1967, MAGI's own software for creating and animating 3D objects. The company would then go on to produce a slew of CGI for commercials, culminating in their 1981 hiring by Disney to create over 50% of the CG scenes for Tron, including the groundbreaking light cycle scene. One of the principal animators on this project was Chris Webb, who during his time at MAGI would meet 5 like-minded individuals: Eugene Trubetskoy, a theoretical physicist and one of the first computer animators; Mike Ferraro, a member of MAGI's R&D team who made VR simulations for the Navy; Carl Ludwig, an electrical engineer who worked on NASA's lunar module; David Brown, a marketing executive from CBS and Fox; and managing producer Alison Brown. It would ultimately be this team of 6 who'd leave MAGI and found Blue Sky in 1987, after which they developed their own proprietary renderer and CGI studio, established themselves with VFX work for movies and commercials alike, and showcased the full extent of CGI studio with their 1998 short, Bunny. Bunny would end up being a huge boon for Blue Sky, not only revolutionizing computer animation with CGI Studio's realistic multi-source ray-traced lighting, but it would also land them their lone Oscar win for Best Animated Short and provide them with the opportunity to make their first animated feature, Ice Age. Our story takes us all the way back into prehistory, where an impending ice age is on its way in and the animals are on their way out. That is, except for one. Meet Manny, a woolly mammoth who opts against migration and instead walks solo towards the icy tundra. Along the way, he meets Sid, an abandoned sloth whom he saves from getting his ass kicked and ends up getting stuck with on his journey north, much to Manny's dismay. Elsewhere, Diego, a saber-toothed tiger, is tasked by his pack leader to retrieve the infant son of their enemy human tribe's chief, only for the baby's mother to scoop up the child and make a perilous escape down a waterfall. Soon after, Manny and Sid encounter the human mother at a riverbank, where she gives her baby to Manny for safekeeping before disappearing into the rushing water. The two try to return the baby to the local human settlement, only to find that they've moved camp. Diego then steps in, claiming to know where the humans are headed and offers to lead the duo towards the next camp, when in reality, he's leading them towards a trap at the hands of his pack. Now this makeshift pack of prehistoric animals must make their way north by overcoming the elements and enduring each other's company. In contrast to all the complicated, high-tech bullet points that make up Blue Sky's origins, Ice Age is a film that succeeds by keeping things simple. The color palette is kept in naturalistic hues, the textures aren't overcomplicated, only add as much detail as is necessary. Solid features like giant walls of ice, various pieces of rock work, or even Manny's tusks are crafted with these angular lines that help retain some of the charm and personality of the original 2D concept art, rather than aiming for perfect recreations of reality. The humans may be low-res and ugly, but their blocky features do help distinguish them from those of Pixar or DreamWorks, and in a way they kind of remind me of how Star Wars The Clone Wars would approach their characters' faces and head shapes years later. And most importantly of all, things are also kept remarkably straightforward on the story and characters front as well. The film is structured as your classic road trip movie mixed with a 3 idiots and a baby scenario, with the bulk of the movie carried on the backs of those 3 moronic mammals. Manny, Sid, and Diego work really well together as a group. Comedically, they bounce off one another with their opposing personalities, with Sid antagonizing the group like the moronic self-aggrandizing goofball that he is, Diego as a slick outsider whose cool facade fades once pushed too far, and Manny being the witty parent of the group who grouchily tries to maintain order. Dramatically, however, is where the group finds some common ground. Sid was ditched by his family during the migration, eventually finding a new family that sticks with him no matter how annoying he may be at times. Diego finds himself torn between serving a pack that values him for his skills and a new makeshift pack that values him for his presence, eventually deciding to redeem himself by going against his old pack leader's wishes. And Manny allows himself to get attached to and care for a new herd, including the human baby, even after having his previous herd killed at the hands of human hunters. A plot point that's beautifully conveyed to the audience via 2D animated cave paintings without the aid of dialogue, which is actually one of the movie's strong suits. All throughout Ice Age are a bunch of great sequences with little to no dialogue, letting the visuals on screen take over without losing an ounce of efficiency or entertainment value. Comedically, the cutaways to Scrat are the best examples of this, as he zips around with his bouncy run cycle like a little gremlin looking for a place to hide his acorn, only to be denied time after time again in the most hilariously cruel ways possible. This guy gets squeezed by giant walls of ice until his eyes bulge out, trampled by giant mammals struck by lightning, tricked into concussing himself by a cave painting, and is even robbed by the tides en route to a full-on meltdown throughout the course of the film, with Chris Wedge's manic grunts tying it all together to give us some truly great slapstick comedy. My favorite of these sequences growing up was always the dodo bird sequence, where a group of suicidally idiotic dodo birds fight with the gang over their stash of melons, culminating in a slow-mo punt return by Sid as he jukes, stiff arms, and dives his way to victory. But the film also uses these wordless sequences to explore character, as shown by both the aforementioned cave painting sequence and a midpoint musical montage set to Rusted Roots' Send Me On My Way. Not only do you get some funny one-off gags like the stoplight geyser or Sid's snotsicles, You also get little character beats where the group starts to bond, like the 2-part gag of Manny getting hit by the snowball and respecting the baby's quick wit, or the moments where Diego has to scramble to keep his cover-up going, like when he changes the tiger prints into human footprints, or when he sends Scrat into orbit before he gets exposed. Poor little guy just can't catch a break. Hell, the montage even foreshadows the geyser mechanics that will end up saving Manny's hide later in the film, preventing it from feeling like a Deus Ex Machina cop-out. This is the sort of efficient montage that I was alluding to in last year's review of Atlantis, a film whose montage only serves to reinforce what we already know and refuses to iterate on that information. Whereas Ice Age takes the character dynamics and plot info that we know, develops them further by creating situations that grow friendships and suspicions alike, and ties it all together with some rock-solid execution. And I think that's the word that I'd use to describe Ice Age overall. Solid. It sets out to be a good family animated film with likable characters, silly gags, and a few heartfelt moments to boot, and it succeeds in doing just that, which is something that I appreciate. Not every movie needs to blow your mind or reinvent the wheel. Sometimes you just need an unpretentious but earnestly entertaining 7 out of 10 type movie to lighten up your day. And I'll be damned if Ice Age doesn't do just that. You know, for one reason or another, it just feels like certain styles of filmmaking are better suited for telling certain types of stories than others. Faux documentary approaches like mockumentaries and found footage films seem best suited to comedy and horror respectively, as the former allows us to stew in the absurdity of a given moment, while the latter can amplify the scare factor by making the far-fetched feel all too real. CG animation for the longest time seemed best suited for films grounded in the real world, with its photo-accurate renderings of hair, light, and water simulations reigning supreme, before trailblazers like the Peanuts movie and Into the Spider-Verse helped cause an industry-wide shift towards stylization. And of course, puppet-based stop-motion in the United States has colloquially been associated with holiday specials and horror-adjacent projects for years, much due in part to the tactile, toy-like nature of works from Rankin-Bass, Tim Burton, Henry Selick, the brothers Quay, and Laika, among others. But long before this association was ever formed in the United States, Europe had always used puppet-based stop-motion as the perfect vehicle for a different type of story, namely folk and fairy tales. From the earliest films in this style back in the 1930s all the way through to the rest of the 20th century, numerous filmmakers across the continent have utilized the innate appeal of these moving puppets to tell these timeless tales, with many of my favorite examples coming from the same country, Czechia. Historically, Czech animators have not only been the most prolific in this cinematic niche, but also the most varied, ranging from the classical beauty of Yuri Trinka, the demented imagination of Jan Svankmajer, all the way to the German expressionist leanings of Jiri Barta's 1986 adaptation of The Pied Piper. And it's here where we find a bridge to our next nominee, as one of the animators on the project, Vlasta Pospisilova, would eventually team up with fellow animator Oral Klimts to co-direct yet another of these stop-motion excursions, Jan Verich's Finfarum. This anthology film frames itself around Czech author Jan Verich presenting the audience with 5 tales from his latest book, Finfarum. The first story, When the Leaves Fall from the Oak, follows a lazy alcoholic farmer who neglects his farm to the point of ruin, succinctly visualized by hard cuts between the farmer throwing back shots of whiskey and images of his livestock disappearing and his front gate falling apart. But one day, he encounters the devil himself, who offers the farmer a deal that would see his prosperity rise to never-before-seen heights in exchange for anything within his home that he's currently unaware of to be given over on the day of the devil's choosing. The farmer signs the contract, unable to think of anything on his property that he hasn't accounted for, only for him to return home and see in horror that his wife has unexpectedly given birth to their firstborn son. Now the clock ticks as the farmer must think of a way to outwit the devil before he returns for his only child. This segment is not only the longest of the 5 segments at 26 minutes, but also comfortably the best in my opinion. It makes great use of its pacing all throughout. allowing enough time for the farmer to grow, relapse, and grow again, provide not one but two clever solutions to the devil's deals, complete with an infernal crash out at the end of it, and show off the film's spot-on approach to aesthetic. The aesthetic of Fimpharum is perfect given the subject matter, taking cues from the off-putting wooden puppets of Svankmeyer's Punch and Judy or Barta's Pied Piper to convey the darkly humorous subject matter, while still retaining enough toy-like appeal a la Rankin-Bass via stubby frames, rounded heads, and prominent eyes. The colors also follow suit, opting for worn browns and backgrounds full of faded watercolors to emulate the pages and illustrations of an old children's storybook. And each story even gives its own slight variation on this style too, with this first tale employing spring coil whirlwinds and industrial hells shown via frequent Dutch angles, and flat faces adorned with painted on eyes and mouths as compared to the more pliable ones used later on in the film. Speaking of which, the second tale on the docket is Fearless Frankie, the story of a man who's never known fear. So his father sends him out to a haunted bar to hopefully encounter some creepy customers and get the spooks scared into him. I'll be upfront, this is probably my least favorite short of the bunch. There's no motivation given as to why the father would be so troubled by Frankie's lack of fear, which is kind of a big deal considering that it's what motivates the plot to progress. Maybe if Frankie was portrayed as being overly brazen due to his fearlessness and a bit of fear was hypothesized to help rein in his behavior, then it could have made the midnight antics with the ghouls feel like more than just a series of aimless antics. But even then, the segment isn't without merit. The chaotic merriment within the bar reminds me a lot of classic stop-motion shorts like Starowitz's The Mascot. The brief switch up to cutout animation for Frankie's backstory was a welcome change, and the designs of the ghouls channel Nightmare Before Christmas era Burton and Selleck in the best way possible with their oblong head shapes and odd jaw features. But my favorite design in the whole film undoubtedly belongs to the title character of the next tale, Mean Barbara. A miserly old hag whose selfishness sets off a chain of underhanded actions including theft, deception, and comically incidental battery within her own town. Barbara's design is hilarious to me, with her hunched back, hooked nose, and absurdly large eyes conveying the nagging wrath of an elderly woman who's long since stopped caring, which synergizes well with the overall silly tone of the story. This is the lone tale that I would strictly classify as a comedy, due not only to the humorous designs of Barbara and the townsfolk, just look at the absolute schnozzes on these guys, but also the farcical nature of the plot. Everybody in the village is an absolute buffoon, with each character scrambling around trying to cover up their schemes and pass them along to the next guy in line like a screwy game of hot potato. And while other versions of this story would have the villagers realize the error of their ways and turn over a new leaf, Fimpharum laughs at the very notion of redeeming these characters by mockingly naming the town Givemore, as in give me more, and have the narrator tell the audience that if they want a moral ending to go read some fairy tales instead. And this is something that I appreciate about Fimpharum as a whole, as it's not afraid to keep it real and have characters remain stagnant if the plot demands it, or insert traditionally unsavory elements into a fairy tale context like alcoholism, cheating, or in the case of our next tale, serial gambling. A Dream Fulfilled tells the tale of a serial gambler who sells all that he and his wife own to bet on the winning numbers, claiming that they've been revealed to him in a recurring dream by their dead relatives. This section is easily my favorite in terms of visuals. The character animation is the strongest in the film, with tons of solid physical acting like when our protagonist is drunk at home or giving a flirtatious wink on the street, and the wife's facial expressions always manage to make me smile, with her round face, big nose, and assortment of wide-eyed stares injecting infinite amounts of appeal into the short. The city and its citizens are another highlight here, utilizing Dada-esque cutout animation in the vein of Monty Python for their higher class residents, and more illustrative designs for the Commonwealth to great effect. And last in this film's collection of tall tales is the titular Fimpharum, the story of a blacksmith whose cheating wife and her lover plan to manipulate him into either offing himself or getting executed so they can continue their affair, only for him to receive help from magical creatures during his lowest moments. This is probably the most fairy tale-like story of the bunch, what with its put-upon protagonist, magical helpers, conditional spells, and moral resolution in the end, which on the one hand provides us with the best use of narration yet with its large cast of characters, and it bookends the film well alongside the similarly structured first segment, but on the other hand, it also exacerbates what I find to be the movie's weakest aspect. You see, due to the overall uniformity in style and tone across the film's 100-minute runtime, redundancy and fatigue can start to seep in, especially when you take into account that most of these tales, the first and last ones especially, are very cyclical in nature, hitting similar beats multiple times within the same segment in classic fairy tale style. But regardless of these minor misgivings, I'd say Thymtharum still works in the end. Funnily enough, I may have never even seen this movie if it wasn't for this series, as I'd never heard of it before nor seen it on TV here in America. And now after 2 viewings during the making of this video, it's gone from a complete unknown to my 4th nominee for this year's crop of films. From the very beginning, Studio Ghibli has been held up by its 3 founding pillars: producer extraordinaire Toshio Suzuki, and the two-headed dragon of directors Isao Takahata and Hayao Miyazaki. Throughout Ghibli's first 11 films, only 1995's Whisper of the Heart had another director at the helm, with Yoshifumi Kondo directing and Miyazaki serving as the film's writer. But as time passed and Miyazaki began his eternal dance with retirement as early as 1997, the need for additional directing talent became ever more prescient. A unique opportunity would present itself circa 1999, as Ghibli would be commissioned to produce a 20-minute cat-centric short film for a theme park. The so-called Cat Project would be centered around characters from 1995's Whisper of the Heart, and released in tandem with a manga by the story's original mangaka, Aoi Hiragi. The theme park deal would eventually fall through, leading Miyazaki to use the project as a testing ground for future directors. As time passed, the project increased in scope, with the film's runtime ballooning from 20 minutes to 45 minutes, all the way to a full-on feature thanks to the efforts of this guy. Meet Hiroyuki Morita, director on episode 3 of the GOAT anime comedy Golden Boy, and key animator on My Neighbors the Yamadas, who take Hiragi's cat manga and adapt it into a massive 525-page storyboard. Upon seeing the storyboard, Ghibli's executives were so impressed that they decided to appoint Morita as director of the project and use his storyboard as the basis of the film, eventually hitting theaters in 2002 under the new title of The Cat Returns. Our story follows Haru, an ordinary girl who's on course for a tough day. She oversleeps her alarm clock, ends up late to school, has her classmates all laugh at her, and even when she finally finds a moment of peace, it's interrupted by a wayward dodgeball to the head. But everything soon changes after Haru manages to save a mysterious cat from being run over. A cat who then stands on his hind legs, thanks Haru for saving his life, and promises to repay her good deed before scurrying off. Later that night, a royal procession of bipedal cats shows up at Haru's doorstep. They inform Haru that the cat she'd saved was none other than the king's only son, Prince Loon, and as a result, a wide assortment of thank you gifts will be showered upon her starting tomorrow. Fast forward to the morning and Haru finds herself absolutely overwhelmed by the cat's array of gifts, including a mountain of lacrosse sticks, an entire lawn litter of cattails, dozens of gift-wrapped mice inside her locker, and to top it all off, they've also arranged to sweep her away to the Cat Kingdom and hitch her off to their prince tonight. Now at the suggestion of a mysterious voice, a flustered Haru must make her way to the Cat Bureau and seek the aid of a truly fantastic feline before it's too late. This one's a true overlooked gem in the Ghibli canon, the sort of light, family-friendly fantasy film that makes for a real cozy watch. Obviously, the film's aesthetic helps a lot with setting this tone by making things easy on the eyes and ears. The colors are soft and a bit desaturated, the lighting and shading are kept to a Hosoda-like minimum. The The character design favors round, friendly contours like the noodly arms and torsos of the cats. The music is wistful and unobtrusive in a Fantasyland sort of way. And just as the title suggests, the return of the Baron from Whisper of the Heart brings with it a whole bunch of cute cats for us to enjoy all throughout the picture. We've got fat cats, regal cats, soldier cats, cats in international garb, the Baron's sleek and precise fit, security cats with suit and tie fur patterns chucking anyone who approaches the king off the premises. And as far as the king himself is concerned, he's got a hilariously mischievous design complete with scraggly fur, an Eggman mustache, and drooping angular eyes. Dude must be Wilfred Warrior's ancient ancestor or something. All these designs are so charming both in stills and in motion. But the main thing that carries the film's appeal and cozy nature for me overall is just how laid back it is at its core. Every character in the movie has this casual way of reacting and interacting, rarely ever getting to the point where they start losing their head, yelling, and flipping out like your stereotypical comedic anime fare. In fact, the most common interaction in this movie is for someone to be upset over something, have the character next to them offer a counterpoint or suggestion, and then they either just roll with it, or at least give it some consideration first. When Natoru first informs Haru of the king's plan to wed her off to the prince, she's naturally flustered and denies it politely, only for Natoru to tell her that the royal family thinks highly of her, and that the prince is cool as hell, which forces Haru to pause for a moment and wonder if it's not such a bad idea after all. When Muta starts getting all pissy about Haru being separated from his watchful eye, Natoru immediately points out the free refreshments in the room next door, which Muta then calmly enters and begins to chow down on while the staff watches completely unbothered. A movie less in tune with its own sensibilities would probably just default to the usual trope of overreaction, but this measured way of handling heightened emotion not only helps solidify its light tone and make its humor hit the mark, but it also emphasizes the rare instances where characters do end up flipping out. The main examples in my mind being when Haru realizes that she's slowly turning into a cat, the primary device for urgency in the plot's latter half, and the various outbursts of the king while in his kingdom, which helps cement him as this gremlin-like pseudo-villain who plays an almost Looney Tunes-like role with his harebrained schemes. Even the movie's action sequences can be wonderfully unserious, as many of them often involve characters bickering, being defeated due to sheer stupidity, or having the entire scenario suddenly undercut for comedic effect. It all comes together to make a film that's equal parts charming fantasy adventure and silly farce, which really helps it stand out from the rest of Ghibli's roster as one of its more unique offerings in my opinion. And though many wouldn't necessarily consider it as one of their more significant movies, it did end up starting an important trend for the studio's future. Following The Cat Returns, Ghibli's next 9 films would see 5 different directors at the helm, ranging from in-house talent to international collaborators, which given the near duopoly of the prior decades, is nothing to sneeze at. And so for that reason, along with everything that I've already outlined thus far, I think it's high time that The Cat Returns gets some much due respect, hence why it's the 5th and final nominee on this year's list. And so, after covering all 5 nominees, the time has come to reveal my retrospective winner for the 2002 Best Animated Feature Film Oscar. But before that, I'd like to give a quick shout out to 2 films that just barely missed the list: Song of the Miraculous Hind and The Boy Who Wanted to Be a Bear, as I was only able to obtain an English translated copy for the former while editing this video, and the latter somehow managed to elude me until very recently. So, if you want to know my thoughts on those films, then let me know, and maybe I'll record an off-the-cuff follow-up video and make an updated ranking for the end of it. With all that out of the way, let's reveal our winner. And the winner is... Lilo and Stitch. For me, it really just comes down to how effectively the film balances its extremes. The action is as fun and well coordinated as the characterization is layered. The sci-fi concepts are as imaginative as the humans are grounded. And the comedic scenes are as funny and plentiful as the touching ones are emotionally affecting. It's a phenomenal film that takes a tried and true structure that could so easily have devolved into pure cliche, but manages to turn those conventions into pure gold through impeccable execution. I gotta give major credit to co-writers and directors Chris Sanders and Dean DeBlois, as they do something very similar with 2010's How to Train Your Dragon, which for my money is still the best DreamWorks film to date. And while Lilo & Stitch may not be my favorite Disney movie ever, it is far and away in my eyes the best film that they've made in the new century. Looking at my final rankings for the year, one thing that really jumps out to me is the preponderance of 2D films that were released this year. In fact, out of every year that I've charted for Keyframe thus far, that being from 2001 up through 2022, 2002 actually has the highest prevalence of 2D animated films out of any other year from this 2-decade span, accounting for 81% of this year's selections. And that would be even larger if Song of the Miraculous Hind and The Boy Who Wanted to Be a Bear were included. Looking forward to 2003, the last year in which Disney would ever release more than 2 animated films in a given year, it'll be interesting to see if they can defend their crown. But before I sign off, there's just a little update that I want to provide you guys with first. Moving forward, the format for Keyframe will be changing a bit, shifting towards a slightly looser and less scripted style for 2 main reasons. First and foremost is that I want to be able to upload these videos more frequently, as the current way that I construct these videos is far too time intensive to be able to churn them out consistently while also working on in-betweens, working a full-time job, and doing everything except the thumbnails on my own. But yeah, I actually want to be able to finish this series one day, and given that the crop of films will only get bigger as the years go on, for example, this year had 16 films, 18 if you include the other 2 that just missed the mark, whereas later ones yielded totals that double and even triple that total according to my charts. A change for expediency must be made. And second, I feel like Keyframe will inevitably become more of a review and ranking gauntlet rather than a retrospective series over time given the scope and nature of the project. So I'll probably be prioritizing less time towards inconsequential or uninteresting films and more towards ones that are either historically significant or veer towards the extreme edges of quality for one reason or another in order to optimize the video's focus. I hope you guys will understand this change in direction, and I'm more than open to any suggestions in the comment section if you have any ideas as to how you think the making of these videos can be optimized while still maintaining quality. So yeah, that's all I have to say on this matter, and to those who stayed until the end, thank you so much. Your continued support has meant so much to me and helps make all the hours that have gone into this channel feel all the more worthwhile, and I hope you'll stay tuned for what's to come. So until then, thanks for watching.